This is Atomic Shinobi, and today I'm going to narrate third and final part of What If Naruto was saved by his Shinigami mother. If you enjoy this video, please like, share and subscribe to this channel. Now wasting no more time, let's start the story.
The video kept playing Naruto's memories until Lisa finally yelled, "I can't take it any longer." As her eyes started to flash gold and a white substance started to form on her face, she tore out her Zanpakuto 2 and charged at the television, hacking at it with it. "Easy Lisa, easy, just calm down." Shinji grabbed her and held her down, and as the adrenaline surged through her body, Lisa shivered in Shinji's grasp before dropping her sword and beginning to take deep breaths. As he picked up what was left of the TV, Love sighed and threw it in a nearby trash can, saying, "Aw damn, and that TV was on sale too. Sigh, oh well. How could you, his mother, have let such things happen to him?" Rojiro asked, turning to Soifun. "I thought he was dead, you asshole," Soifun yelled at the former Taicho, who had wavy hair. "I was misled by some jerks in his hometown that he had passed away. You last foppish bastard, how in the world could I have prevented it when I had no idea he was still alive?" When Rojiro sensed Soifun's Ryotsu and intent to kill, he jumped back, which truly frightened him. While the other Vizards were recovering from witnessing Naruto's terrible existence, Hiyori had woken up and approached the blonde, who was seated in a tiny chair. The blonde shivered and shielded his head with his arms, waiting for Hiyori to hit him. He felt a gentle pat on his head, and when he looked up, he saw Hiyori grinning at him. She ruffled his hair and said, "I promise. It's okay kiddo, I ain't going to hurt y'all." Naruto nodded his head and grinned as he looked into her eyes and saw nothing but complete sincerity. As Shinji, Urahara, and Soifun conversed, they said, "Okay, so I see why he reacted like he did, but that still does not explain to me why you need our help." Urahara produced a number of folders and gave them to Shinji, saying, "Maybe this will be enough?" Not even a few minutes after taking the folders, Shinji snapped his head up to Urahara and Soifun and said, "This has to be fake." Kazuki and Soifun raised an eyebrow as Shinji continued to read the pages, saying, "If this is what he has turned into, Yamamoto would never let that boy live on. If that bastard so much as tries to harm my child, he'll wish that Makora had killed him," Soifun said with a snort and turned away. "Makora?" Shinji said, raising an eyebrow. "A topic to be discussed later. For now, we have important business," Kazuki said, grabbing the folders and putting them away. "Are you going to assist us?" With a sigh, Shinji took a seat and said, "I'm not sure if we can, to be honest. It's one thing for a Shinigami to learn to control their inner hollow, but given Naruto's demonic aura, Shinigami abilities, and his father's innate qualities, I'm not sure how we can support him." With fear in her eyes, Soifun jerked her head in Shinji's direction and said, "But. You must." She took Shinji by the coat and said, "Please, I don't want my son to be consumed by his inner hollow. I want him to be safe and sound. If I let that happen, I don't know how I would be able to live with myself." Whoa lady, hold on," Shinji said, grabbing Soifun by the wrist and ripping her away from him. "We'll do our best to assist him. We simply don't know what might occur. Hell, we barely survived our hollowifications without doing too much damage, and even then, it was mostly just pure luck. We have no idea what will happen if we attempt the same tactic with Naruto." "Well, then, I guess we will have to make some alterations," Kazuki said, grinning and stroking his chin, "will we not?" In other places situated in a fenced-in area in the middle of nowhere, the mansion was large enough to fit a king or noble, and even the Japanese emperor would be pleased with it. The manor appeared deserted from the outside, but the interior was a whole other story. A grand room with a great fireplace and 12 people inside was illuminated. With a frustrated sigh, one of them got to his feet and said, "How much longer must we wait for that damned bastard to arrive? For Kami's sake? We've already waited for 3 hours." The man wore shorts and a sleeveless shirt with black trim, a red collar around his neck, and a single seed-shaped gem on the front. His hair was orangish red, long and disheveled on one side and clean and cropped short on the other. "Patience Mabashi, I'm sure that Fenrir will be here soon," said a man seated in an armchair facing the fire. "I don't understand why you bothered to send him," snorted a woman who was lying on a couch. "We don't require her assistance." The woman wore beige pants and a purple Chinese style pow. Her hair was dark teal. Patience Yoshi, the woman, now Yoshi, turned to see a woman with silky blonde hair, an elaborate katana at her side that she was lightly tracing her finger across, an oriental kimono styled in the feudal era with swans and sakura blossoms along the fabric, and an oriental comb in her hair. "Lord Carria knows what he is doing," she said. "Honestly, can't they just stay quiet and just follow the plan?" 3 men in the corner sighed as they listened to the other people argue. The man, who had black dress pants, a red tie, a button, up shirt, big glasses, and dark hair combed to one side, picked up a chess piece and moved it forward. "Why are you whippersnappers talking so much?" snorted the man in front of him. The elderly, wrinkled man, dressed in a full black suit with a purple undergarment underneath, scowled as he slowly moved another chess piece. "Oh, for the love of it, will the two of you just shut up? Your jabbering is not making my research any easier." The two turned to face the final man seated in the corner, who was sitting in front of a table covered in a variety of documents, all of which were incredibly complex in form. He had brown hair that was neatly combed, a white button, up shirt underneath his bloody lab coat, and brown trousers. He had a heart-shaped locket around his neck. The elderly gentleman sighed. Whether we were quiet or not would not matter, Victor, as you are still as incompetent as ever. Now, Sawatari, is it really a good idea to antagonize the good doctor?" The man with the glasses scowled. "He has, after all, been a huge help to us with our work, hasn't he? Why, may I ask, are we still hiding in a manner like a bunch of cowards if he has helped Ugaki so much?" snorted Sawatari. Slam! Suddenly, everyone's focus shifted to a large oak door, where two figures emerged, a beautiful woman with brown hair being held by the arm by a man who looked feral. A large man with short red hair and an orange mohawk grabbed her by the arms as she attempted to stand up after the man snorted and pushed her in, causing her to fall to the ground. The woman fought against the man's hold, saying, "Release me." She then made an unsuccessful attempt to kick him. The man approached a chair, seated her, and then took a step back. The now named Yoshino snapped her head to her side to see who had said, "I wouldn't do that if I were you, Lady Yoshino." The woman moved to leave the chair. The man had a big beard and short brown hair that fanned out at the ends. He was dressed in a light vest, a white button, up shirt, and a tie. A golden watch was partially visible in a front pocket. "Why is that Ryo?" Yoshino scoffed at the man. She looked up as she felt a sudden weight on her shoulder, and her eyes slightly widened. The man smiled and gave her a gentle pat on the cheek, saying, "Because, my dear Yoshino, it would be most unfortunate that I would have to injure that pretty face of yours if you tried to escape again. We wouldn't want that, would we?" After swatting the man's hand away, Yoshino got to his feet and yelled, "Karya, please stop touching me." As the now named Karya fully revealed himself, she assumed a fighting stance and said, "I refuse to take part in your accursed schemes." The man wore an orange tie, a red shirt with a black geometric pattern on it, white hair that pointed to the sides, and a small scar on his chin. Karya laughed and moved forward. "Yoshino, sweetheart, really think you can beat me?" Yoshino clenched her fist as he approached her. Yoshino snarled and threw her fist at Karya, who caught it before it hit him. Then, Karya's foot hit her in the side, causing her to smash into a wall with spiderweb cracks running through it. She moaned in agony on the floor before passing out. With a sigh, Karya returned to his chair and said, "Fenrir, please bring her to her quarters." He sat down while Yoshino was being picked up by the big, untamed man. He carried Yoshino upstairs and nodded his head as he went up the stairs. After taking a seat and grabbing a glass of wine, Karya said, "So, Victor, how much longer until we can make our plans official?" "Not much longer," said the man in the bloody lab coat as he got to his feet and picked up some paper. "All of my research will be useless unless we can get the final component to our concoction," he said, placing the paper on Karya's armchair. "Acquiring the item itself will not be an easy task." He put the papers down and picked up another one, saying, "Thanks to my research on Quincy artifacts, I was able to discern what the Quincy's are capable of that would allow us to make our stand, however." After grabbing the paper and examining it, Karya frowned and said, "You are correct, this will be a difficult item to acquire." He got up and put down his wine cup after finishing it, saying, "But, it is far from beyond our reach." He turned his head and said, "Ho, Ban, I want the two of you to head to this location." He took a roll-up map out of his pocket and tossed it to them, saying, "You know what to do when you get there." He said to the two twin boys, each holding a bottle of water, "As you wish, Lord Karya." As Karya poured himself another glass of wine, the two left the room. "So, my lord, what exactly do we need to finally accomplish our goals?" the blonde woman asked Karya. "All in due time, Mizer, all in due time," Karya replied, grinning at her and taking a sip of his wine. The following day, since Naruto was more than just a Shinigami who acquired hollow powers, rather, he was a Shinigami who had literally become a part of his inner hollow, it was impossible to predict what might happen. Kazuki, Shinji, Soifun, Hiyori, and the other Vizards had spent the entire night preparing the procedure that would hopefully give Naruto control over his inner hollow. They had taken their regular training area and created a huge circular pit covered in Seiki rock, with Naruto sitting in the center. Hachi had created a number of barrier pillars to contain the excess Ryotsu on the pit's edges. Shinji turned to Kazuki and said, "We must first get Naruto to awaken his blade because he does not yet have a Zanpakuto. He should be able to awaken his Zanpakuto through this process without letting his inner hollow run wild. Before we teach him to control his inner hollow, we can teach him how to properly soothe his Zanpakuto once he has acquired it." Soifun turned to Shinji and asked, "Are you positive it will work?" With a sigh, Shinji turned to face Soifun and said, "I'll tell you the truth. I am not sure right now," he said, turning to face Naruto. This procedure was designed to help young people who have the potential to become Shinigami awaken their Zanpakuto before encroachment took hold. He sighed and crossed his arms, saying, "To be honest, he might not even awaken his Zanpakuto. He is a Shinigami, not a soul, and this could have a significant impact on how his Zanpakuto turns out." Fear seized Soifun as she gazed down at her child and said, "Never awaken his Zanpakuto." "I am sure he will be fine, Soifun," Kazuki said, giving him a shoulder pat. "He will definitely have a Zanpakuto because he knows who his mother is. Just relax," he said, giving her shoulder a light squeeze. "Thank you, Kazuki." Soifun grinned and nodded her head, turning back to face her cross-legged son. Hachi turned to Shinji, who said, "Begin." Hachi put his palms together and nodded his head, causing a surge of Ryotsu to sweep across the deep pit. As the Ryotsu surrounded him, Naruto closed his eyes and inhaled deeply before dozing off on his back. "Now all we can do is wait," Kazuki said, tapping his cane. "Be safe, my son," Soifun said, clasping her hands over her heart as she gazed at him. The mindscape, a sudden flash of bright light flooded Naruto's eyes, causing them to flutter open. He sat up, rubbed his eyes, and started to observe his surroundings. There were 2 statues of dragons on either side of the enormous cave where he was sitting. He jumped up and started to look around. He knew exactly where he was, inside his mindscape, but where was his brother, his inner hollow? "This way, child." Naruto turned back to face the cave and froze. He glanced around and said, "Who's there? Come on. This way, boy." Another voice, this one with a darker tone, caused Naruto to freeze. "Are you down there?" he asked, glancing toward the cave where he heard the voices. "Yes, child, please come quickly, we haven't much time. Be quick, whelp, or I shall feast upon your bones." Despite his fear at hearing the 2 voices, Naruto decided to go down the cave for an unknown reason. The statue's eyes glowed as he entered, and a glow swept across the cave's mouth as dense vines covered the entrance. Amidst the sounds of rushing air and cracking rock, Naruto stumbled down the dark cavern, but he persisted in his journey despite the growing fear within him. After what seemed like hours, he finally emerged from the long, narrow cavern and was both awed and frightened by what he saw. He looked at a huge cavern that could likely hold all of Konohagakure and more. The ground was covered in stalagmites and rivers of water and magma, and steam was ejected from vents as a tidy fog covered a portion of the terrain. But there was a magnificent sight in the sky that was simply astounding. With their enormous wings spread wide, 2 enormous serpentine dragons circled and swung around one another, slashing at one another as they dove into the fog below and then emerged from it to resume their aerial conflict. As he watched their elegant yet terrifying battle, Naruto could only stare in awe. "Wow!" he exclaimed as he moved forward, knocking a small rock off the ledge and sending it crashing into the ground. At the sound of the rock crashing, the dragons halted their battle and shifted their focus to Naruto, flying in his direction without pausing. Panicked, Naruto saw them coming toward him and was about to run to the cave from which he had come, but it was blocked by vines. He looked around and saw a small path that led down to the ground, so he hurried toward it, narrowly avoiding one of the dragon's claws. The dragons followed him faster than he could run, crawling along the walls as he ran as fast as he could. When Naruto noticed a vine sticking out of the rock face, he jumped off against his better judgment in the hopes of catching it on his fall, only to be caught in one of the dragon's claws. Naruto was taken with the dragons as they leapt from the wall and flew into the thick, dark fog. Abruptly, they emerged from the mist and landed near what looked like a stalagmite, but the top was apparently severed, leaving a level surface. The dragons curled around the stalagmite, gazing at the blonde, and dropped Naruto onto the level ground. Naruto moaned in agony and sat up, then looked up to see the 2 dragons more clearly. The first dragon had white scales that glinted in the light from the lava, and it had a gorgeous set of feathered, smooth wings with a light trail of white feathers trailing behind the great dragon as it moved its wings. Its claws were pure white and immaculate. However, the great dragon's wings were tattered and bat-like, with flesh hanging from the bones like loose string from a blanket. The second dragon's claws were jagged and cracked, and its body was covered in scars. And its onyx black scales seemed to absorb all the light being emitted from the surrounding lava. Both of them had silver eyes with a golden slit, but the black dragon's eyes had a malicious expression behind the pupil, while the white dragon's eyes were serene. Both dragons were so enormous that they were on par with the fabled Kyuubi. Unsure of what to do, Naruto shivered as he glanced between them. Naruto turned to face the white dragon, who spoke in a calm voice that soothed his soul, and said, "Fear not, child, we are only here to assist you." "Well, you're being too gentle. This whelp needs strength, not sympathy." Naruto gazed at the enormous black dragon, which stoked his rage. Turning to face the black dragon, the white dragon said, "Compassion in itself can bring forth strength. True strength comes from lust for battle, not compassion for all things." The black dragon snorted. Anyo. The two dragons ceased their bickering and looked down towards Naruto. Who are you?" After exchanging glances, the two dragons nodded their heads. "We are souls that will guide you through the harshest of battles," said the white dragon. "According to the black dragon, we are the avatars of the power which shall call you to the forefront of warfare." Both of them simultaneously said, "We are the spirits of your Zanpakuto too." "My name is," the white dragon said, extending its clawed hand. Likewise, the black dragon said, "And my name is." "What was that? I didn't hear what you said," said Naruto, raising an eyebrow. The two dragons let out a sorrowful sigh. First to speak, the white dragon said, "It seems you are not ready to hear our names, so sad." "Perhaps if he were stronger he could command us," the black dragon growled. Before launching themselves into the sky to resume their aerial battle, the two dragons spread their wings and said, "When you have found the strength to do what needs to be done, and the power to fight without aid, return to us on your own accord, only then will we kneel to you." There was no sign of Naruto. Beyond mindscape, Shinji attempted to soothe Soifun, who was pacing back and forth and biting her fingernails, saying, "Easy Soifun, he has only been asleep for a couple hours. Don't worry, he should be all right." Soifun turned to Shinji and yelled, "I have every right to be alarmed because my son is in his mindscape, and the only thing I can do to ensure he is safe from his inner hollow is to perform an experimental Zanpakuto awakening ceremony." He sighed and turned to face the young blonde who had been sleeping for 3 hours. "This is getting out of hand," Shinji said, backing away from Soifun as she resumed her pacing. "Hachi does not have enough Ryotsu to keep this going for much longer, and there have been no sign of Naruto gaining anything remotely resembling a Zanpakuto." He clenched his fist and sighed, "Was all this a waste of time?" The blonde Shinigami, meanwhile, sat up in the pit with a groan, got up, and looked around before looking up to see everyone gathered there. "Hey Ka-chan." When Soifun turned to face her son, she grinned broadly and said, "Naruto." She jumped into the ditch and ran down as quickly as she could. As soon as she reached the bottom, she wrapped her arms around him. "Oh my son, I was so worried." "It's okay Ka-chan, I am alright," Naruto said, giving her a pat in return. Soifun grinned and turned to face Naruto when he noticed something strange. "Where is your Zanpakuto, Naruto?" Naruto scowled and looked down, saying, "I met my Zanpakuto spirits, but they said they would not kneel to me unless I proved my strength." He sighed and left her arms. After scowling at her son's justification, Soifun took hold of his shoulder and said, "Then we should start training Naruto." "Come on," she said, picking him up and making her way to the top of the pit. "Your Zanpakuto spirits will be happy to have you as their wielder once I have finished training you." With a broad smile, Naruto gave his mother a hug and said, "Thank you, Ka-chan." In the meantime, Uryu Ishida continued to concentrate on his left arm while he walked down a dark street with a bag of sewing supplies and his books in his right arm. He let his head drop and sighed, "I guess my father was right, really do have no talent." He looked up at the sky and said, "And for what? To kill an enemy that no Quincy in history has ever been able to stand against." He let his left arm drop to his side and said, "Looks like my powers really are gone." Uryu's eyes widened in surprise as he turned a corner and looked up. "Hello there, Quincy boy." The water rushed towards Uryu before he could react, and he saw two young boys standing in front of a pillar of water. A pounding sensation in Uryu's head caused his eyes to open. He let out a loud groan as he reached for his head to clink, but he stopped when he heard metal dragging on stone. He noticed that his vision was blurry as he looked in the direction where the sound had come from. He pushed himself off the ground and got to his feet after reaching up to feel his face and cursing, "Damn, I lost my glasses." After a brief moment of stumbling, he squinted his eyes and looked around. He was unable to make out much because the room he was in was dimly lit. However, he could see that a rectangular frame was surrounded by a number of long lines that were vertical, and the remainder appeared solid and rough black. He became aware of his location and came to a realization. A detention facility. He glanced at his arms and could just make out the shape of the chains that were fastened to his wrists. He made an unsuccessful attempt to remove his hand from it. Uryu sent a shock of pain through the wall as he smashed the side of his fist into it. He lowered his head and slid to the floor, leaning against the wall. How was I able to be so stupid? He ought to have been more ready for an assault. At the sight of such pathetic readiness, his grandfather must be rolling in his grave. Creak. Uryu saw a big, burly man enter his holding cell as he glanced up at the alleged bars. Reaching out and grabbing him, the man appeared to snort before saying, "This way, Quincy," and releasing his chains. After that, he pulled Uryu from the cell. Uryu swiftly swung a fist at the big man, but his blow was deflected and he was flung to the ground with such vicious force that his spine cracked. The man pressed the heel of his boot against Uryu's chest as he attempted to stand. "You have no chance against me, Quincy. Not against a Bount." The man glared at the helpless Quincy before grabbing Uryu by the front of his shirt and tossing him over his shoulder. Then he swiftly pushed Uryu's neck with his index finger, knocking him out. The big man carried Uryu away, helpless as a lamb, and he fell limp on his shoulder. Alongside Soifun as she held her son's hand, Soifun grinned and bowed, saying, "Thank you very much for agreeing to help my son Shinji-san." Shinji grinned. "It was no problem, Soifun, we couldn't just turn him away, could we?" Soifun looked up at them and said, "I will come by later tomorrow, if that is okay with you," after grinning and giggling a little. Hachi grinned. "Of course it is alright, we would love it if you all would join us tomorrow." Glancing down at Naruto, Soifun grinned and said, "Thank you very much for your help. Come on, Sochi, let's get going now." "Yes, Ka-chan." Naruto nodded his head and followed Soifun and Kazuki as they left in the same direction. Sighing, Shinji put his hands in his pockets and followed the other Vizards into the Vizards' warehouse. Hiyori, on the other hand, remained behind and watched Naruto go, grinning despite her glazed, trance-like eyes. "Hiyori, come on, we have to continue with our training," Shinji said, pausing and turning to face her. When Hiyori was awakened from her reverie, she blinked and said, right," before turning to follow the Vizards. Hiyori blushed in embarrassment as Lisa revealed, "Ah, little Hiyori. Chan is in love." The Vizards heard Lisa's statement and burst out laughing. "At least I have a shot at him, unlike you old hag," Hiyori snapped at Lisa, turning her head to the side. As Lisa growled in rage, everyone began to laugh. As Hiyori slammed her fist into Lisa's face, Lisa clutched her nose and yelled, "Oh really? Well, you aren't so young yourself, you damn cradle robber. You are at least 200 or 300 years old, that make you old enough to be his great GR. Oh if..." Lisa grabbed Hiyori. "Why you? Heahh," Hiyori growled before lunging at Lisa and striking her in the face. Lisa abruptly reached up, moved to Hiyori's side, and attacked her. The feud between the two persisted. The other Vizards stood off to the side, staring blankly. "They are really going at it, aren't they?" Rojiro finally said. After a brief period of silence, Love nodded his head and said, "They sure are. I bet Lisa will win." "I am placing my money upon Hiyori's victory," Rojiro said, laughing and sweeping his blonde hair back. After glancing at Hiyori and Lisa, Shinji rolled his eyes and said, "You two are a pair." He sighed and turned around, saying, "I need some sake." "Why do women get so worked up over things like this?" he asked. In the meantime, the fog that had obscured the area was gradually beginning to clear as Naruto, Soifun, and Kazuki made their way towards Karakura. With a puzzled expression on his face, Naruto was holding Soifun's hand quite firmly. "Sochi, what is wrong?" Soifun asked after noticing this. Naruto glanced up at Soifun and blinked. "Ka-chan, can I ask you something?" he said, sighing and turning to face her. "Of course, sweetie, you can ask me anything at all," Soifun said with a gentle smile. "What does it mean to be in love?" Naruto asked, letting out a sigh. This question surprised Soifun a little because he hadn't anticipated it. "Sochi, where did this come up?" With a curious tilt of his head, Naruto said, "Lisa." Chan said Hiyori. Chan was in love. And gestured back toward their origins. "What does it mean to be in love?" he asked. After a moment of staring at Naruto, Soifun sighed. In an attempt to come up with a way to put it, she rubbed her forehead. When Naruto noticed Soifun's annoyance, he retreated, saying, I'm sorry Ka-chan. Didn't mean to offend you." Soifun instantly felt bad after glancing at Naruto. No, you didn't offend me. She gave him a motherly kiss on the forehead and said, "I'm sorry if it seemed that way. It's just that I do not know how to describe it very well." She bent down to pick him up and held him against her. "Oh. Okay." Naruto nodded his head, grinned, and sank into Soifan's chest, letting out a joyful sigh as his mother held him. "Ah, he is so cute, Soifan-chan," Kazuki said with a laugh. "Ah, shut up, you lazy good for noth," Soifan said, giving Kazuki a mild glare. Urahara.san. Soifan.san. As Kazuki, Soifan, and Naruto turned to face Ichigo, they saw him sprinting toward them, followed by Chad and Orihime. They came to a halt in front of them, gasping for air. Looking at Ichigo, Kazuki asked, "Ichigo, what happened?" With a sharp gasp, Ichigo said, "Uryu. Missing. Can't find. Anywhere." Breathing heavily, Orihime stepped forward and handed Soifan Uryu his sewing kit, saying, "We found this." Even when Uryu is fleeing from danger, he never abandons his sewing kit. At that point, it was official. Uryu had experienced something, in other places. A well-made armchair was placed in front of a blazing fireplace in a tastefully decorated living room, and a glass of what looked like wine was placed on a small table that was the size of the chair. Jin Kariya was sitting quietly in the chair, which was lit by the fireplace's blazing light. He extended his hand to the wine glass and raised it to his mouth. He let out a sigh, let a smile spread across his face as he gazed into the fireplace in front of him, and then he leaned back in his chair. "Lord Kariya." With a quiet sigh, the man raised his head and asked, "What is it, Fenrir?" He held his staff in his hands and said, "The Quincy has been found, and has been placed in the designated cell, my lord." Fenrir had a feral appearance. "Excellent." Kariya grinned and got to her feet, turning to face Fenrir. "Shall we?" she asked. With a nod, Fenrir trailed behind Kariya as they made their way down a nearby corridor. "Soon. Everything will come full circle," Kariya said with an even bigger smile and slightly sharper teeth. In the meantime, Uryu always carried his sewing kit with him, and everyone stared at it. Even if his life were on the line, he would not abandon the kit. "Where did you three find this?" Soifan asked, glancing at the kit before turning back to Ichigo, Orihime, and Chad. "I found it while I was walking down the street towards his home. I found it lying behind a trash can near a puddle, and Ichigo said, still gasping for air. "Wait, did you say puddle? In the street?" interrupted Kazuki. "Yes," Ichigo said, nodding his head, "that is exactly what I said, Urahara.san." Kazuki raised his arms. "That is odd. A puddle in the street, and it hasn't rained in the last week, not to mention it is pretty hot outside. This makes no sense." He turned to Ichigo. "By any chance, was there a fire hydrant or something that spilled out water near there?" In response, Orihime said, "No, there was nothing there." Soifan sighed. "Look, all the evidence points that Uryu is missing, and likely something happened to him, pointing out there is a mysterious puddle near where he was as pointless. Let's just look for him." "Soifan, there's the chance that," Kazuki said, turning to face him. "Those of you who can sense Uryu's Ryotsu need to keep an eye out for Uryu's Ryotsu signature." Soifan interrupted him and began yelling commands, turning to Ichigo. "You, Chad, and Orihime will be a group. Me and Kazuki will drop Naruto off at the store and then catch up on our side." While complaining, Naruto said, "But Chan, I want to help find Uryu. Aniki too." Soifan glanced at Naruto and said, "Naruto, you are far too young to be doing something like this. You are being dropped off at Kazuki's shop and that is final, young man." Whimpering, Naruto bowed his head and nodded in agreement. While Orihime, Chad, and Ichigo went in the direction where they discovered Uryu's sewing kit, Soifan picked up Naruto and turned to face the others, saying, "We'll be with you shortly." She and Kazuki then left for the Urahara store. Kazuki maintained an introspective expression while he continued to consider the enigmatic puddle. In the meantime, Uryu moaned in agony as his wounds stretched after being flung roughly into a chair. The big man carrying him swiftly bound his arms before doing the same to his legs. Uryu made an effort to fight, but the restraints were too tight. After he was done, the big man took a step back and said to Uryu, "Stop struggling, it will only make things more difficult for you." "What do you people want with me?" Uryu asked, pausing for a moment before giving the big man a fierce glare. The man turned away and crossed his arms. Uryu snarled as he attempted to escape the ropes securing him, saying, "Hey, answer my question. Why am I here? What do you people want with me?" "Oh, that is quite simple, Quincy boy." When Uryu turned his head and noticed two men standing behind him, his eyes widened. The first man had blood-red crimson eyes and white hair that pointed to the sides. His red shirt with a black geometric pattern and an orange tie highlighted his pale complexion. His chin was slightly scarred. The other man had a savage appearance, as if he hadn't shaved in weeks. He was dressed in a leather trench coat, a pair of torn hiking pants, leather boots, and a filthy muscle shirt underneath the coat. He was carrying a cane with a silver wolf's head on top, but it appeared to be more decorative than functional. The man approached Uryu with a smile and said, "I must apologize for my rudeness, allow me to introduce myself. My name is Jin Karya, leader of the Bounts." He turned to face the big man and said, "This is my long-time friend Gokoga." He turned to face the feral man and said, "And my brother in all but blood, Fenrir Lucian." To answer Uryu's question, he said, "Well, you will find out soon enough. In the meantime, just unwind while we..." Slam. A door slammed open, and a man with a red tie, white button-up shirt, round rimmed glasses, and slick black hair ran in, panting heavily. "My lord," he said. "What is it, Ugaki?" Karya scowled at the man as he turned his head. "It's Yoshino, she's escaped," exclaimed the man, now known as Ugaki, panting heavily. "What?" Karya practically teleported to the man and grabbed him by the throat in a single second. "I told you and Ryo to watch her and keep her from escaping," she said. She took us by surprise, somehow managed to summon her doll," Ugaki exclaimed, panting. "Damn it, find her," snarled Karya, dropping Ugaki in the process. Uryu was watching all of this, not understanding what was happening, when he felt a hand land on his shoulder and flinched. "I see that we have the Quincy boy." As Ugaki walked out of the room, Karya looked around. Koga and Fenrir turned to face the man behind Uryu. The man wore a bloody lab coat over a white button-up shirt and had well-groomed brown hair. He had on a pair of dress shoes and brown pants. There was a single silver chain necklace with a heart-shaped locket around his neck. "Yes, did you doubt my subordinates, doctor?" snorted Karya. The individual nodded. "No, far from it, I am simply surprised that you have captured him with minimal injury, despite whom you sent to retrieve him." Karya made a move to leave, scowling, "As much as I would love to match wits with you, doctor, I have more pressing matters to attend to. Keep Ugaki and Ryo here to guard the Quincy. I shall go and retrieve your precious Yoshino." "That is an odd request for you. Shall I inquire as to why it is you wish to go?" Karya said, pausing and slowly turning his head to face the man, who was now wearing a small smile. The man turned and walked towards the large doors, pushing them open before letting them close behind him. "The final piece to our ultimate goal is now within our reach. We need the Quincy boy protected, and I truly trust none of you to be able to get the job done properly," he said with a smile. Whatever these Bount had planned, Uryu was even more anxious than before and thought it could not be good. Alongside Soifun, now Sochi, "I want you to stay inside until I return. I don't want you to leave the shop, am I clear?" Soifun said, kneeling down and gently placing Naruto on the tiny sofa. With a pout, Naruto nodded his head and said, "Hi, Ka-chan." When Soifun saw Kazuki waiting for her in front of the store, she grinned and got up, saying, "That's a good boy." She gave him a quick peck on the forehead and walked out of the building, saying, "Let's go." Just as she was about to jump away, Kazuki grabbed her shoulder. He had a serious expression on his face when she turned to face him. "Soifun, we need to be careful. We have no idea who it is we are up against." If my memory serves me correctly, the moment he removed that glove when he fired that arrow at Makora, he lost his Quincy powers. What point could there be to kidnap a powerless Quincy? Soifun sighed and shook him off. "I know things seem like they are dangerous, but I highly doubt that Uryu is missing because anyone with spiritual sensing abilities got to him." Kazuki sighed as he rubbed his forehead. He quickly jumped after her, hoping that he was mistaken. "There are more things they could do, Soifun, than you were willing to admit," he said. In the meantime, in search of a hiding spot, Yoshino ran through alley after alley. Knowing that it might be her only option for temporary concealment, she snarled as he crashed into a crowd. She was so determined to hide that she didn't realize she was in someone's direct line of sight until she bumped into them. She flipped them over and moaned in agony as she saw who she had collided with. Beneath her, a boy with tannish skin and spiky orange hair lay looking rather irritated. Lady, would you be so kind as to get off me?" he yelled angrily. I apologize, I was not looking where I was going," Yoshino said as he hastily stood up. Snorting, the boy said, "Yeah, no surprise there." Yoshino sighed at the boy's impoliteness before noticing that two of his friends were standing close by. An extremely tall, dark-skinned man with well-developed muscles and a very developed young girl with gorgeous orange hair. With a groan, the boy said, "Come on, Orihime, Chad, We better find Uryu. He turned to go, but Yoshino caught him by the shoulder and spun him around, her face displaying shock. Did you say Uryu? Uryu Ishida? What do you know? The orange-haired boy growled as the three of them turned to face her. Alongside Naruto, extremely bored, Naruto swung his legs on the couch and sighed. Ururu and Jinta continued to stare at Naruto. With a final sigh, Jinta got up and walked out of the room. Looking at Jinta, Ururu said, Jinta, where are you going? Jinta snapped back, are you kidding me? Do you know how boring it is to babysit a kid who is only allowed to sit on the couch? For the love of Kami. The kid listens to his mother like it is a religion. Why do we need to be watching him? Because Mr. Urahara is suspicious of something. When Jinta froze and slowly turned his head, he noticed a stern-looking Tessai standing directly behind him. His eyes widened. Ururu said, Anyo, why is Mr. Urahara suspicious? In an attempt to defuse the situation. Mr. Urahara did not tell me much, only that it seems like somebody was specifically targeting Uryu for some reason. I don't know how to be honest. He knows something but he is not willing to tell us yet. Tessai sighed as he pushed Jinta back into the room after taking a look at Ururu. He then placed Jinta back on the couch and sat down on the floor. Ururu put her hands in her lap, crossed her fingers, and nodded her head. Do you hear that? Naruto asked, letting out a sigh before his ear twitched and he turned to face the world. Hear what? It is silent as a graveyard outside, Jinta said as everyone turned to stare at Naruto. Tessai closed his eyes and put his hand to his ear before saying, Get do. Tessai started to say, boom, but was interrupted when an explosion ripped through the shop's side, sending the four of them flying several meters. Alongside Kazuki and Soifun, a huge explosion ripped through the air as Soifun and Kazuki landed on the edge of a building. Soifun and Kazuki turned around and looked toward the scene of the explosion. My shop. Kazuki's and Soifun's eyes widened. After a moment of staring, Soifun's eyes became filled with panic. My son! She exclaimed, putting all of her Ryatsu into her feet and jumping toward the explosion, praying to Kami that her child was safe. Returning to the store after he sat up and surveyed the damage, Naruto moaned. He saw Ururu hanging from the ceiling by the back of her shirt, seemingly unconscious, and Tessai crushed beneath the beam, but still alive. Jinta was nowhere to be seen. Hey, Naruto! Quickly turning his head, Naruto saw Jinta pinned beneath the couch by his legs. Help me get this thing off me. It's crushing my legs, Jinta moaned in agony, yelping as he felt his legs being crushed by the couch. Naruto dashed over to try to push the couch away from him, but he collapsed when a sharp pain shot through the back of his head. Naruto! Jinta yelled as the blonde hit the ground head. First, Jinta looked up in agony to see who was attacking him after reaching out to try to wake him up and having a foot crash down on the back of his hand. A fist and a bloody lab coat were the last things he saw. Soifun came on the scene, gasping for air. The scene in front of her caused her eyes to widen in fear. A huge hole had been ripped through one side of the shop, which was completely on fire. When she saw a figure begin to slowly emerge from the flames, she screamed, Naruto, as she dashed towards the flaming building in the hopes of saving her son. The figure appeared to be wearing an overcoat of some kind and was of average height. He seemed to be dragging a little figure, too. A man with well-groomed brown hair, covered in soot, a white lab coat with bloodstains, and a white button-up shirt underneath was visible as the smoke cleared. Brown pants and a locket around his neck in the shape of a heart. Additionally, he was pulling Naruto through the flames by his hair. Unhand my son, you bastard! Soifun yelled as she leapt at the man, releasing her Zanpakuto's Shikai, but her hand was grabbed before it could reach him. With a snort, the man said, You bore me, and flung her aside, causing her to collide with a wallhead on and lose consciousness. He turned and started to leave, but Kazuki's Zanpakuto was revealed, forcing him to quickly turn around and block a strike. Who are you, and what do you want? Kazuki said, squinting his eyes. He swung his foot around and attacked Kazuki after flinging his sword away, grinning and saying, finally somebody with some manners. Before he could look up and give the man a scowl, Kazuki skidded back a few feet and barely had time to block the blow. Reaching up to his locket and placing it between his thumb and index finger, the man grinned and said, Since you asked so nicely, I shall give you my name. Zyge Dick. Likenum. The locket glowed brightly as a light. A sickly green light extended from it. Like dripping ooze, the light slowly trickled downward and gathered at the man's feet, until it exposed a heap of what looked like rotting flesh. The light ceased to flow and lost its glow. What is th? Kazuki said with an eyebrow raise. Snap. The heap of decayed flesh shifted and split, grew bigger, and sporadic fragments of machinery emerged. As Kazuki sensed the tremendous power emanating from the opulent heap of flesh, he took a slow step back and watched in horror as it truly took shape. Its body appeared to have been shabbily sewn together, with stray pieces of machinery protruding from it, including open wires, pipes, and gears. The flesh had degenerated into an abomination, a hulk of festering flesh with a foul stench that was clearly coming from the creature. It stooped until it was resting on its knuckles, which were protruded with spikes from different machine parts. Long rusted pipes protruded from its flesh, dripping sludge, and its arms moved. Behind the rotting flesh, its spine was visible, and one of its eyes had been replaced with a camera lens, and its lips looked as though they had been sewn shut. Who are you? Kazuki asked, covering his mouth to contain his bile as he turned to face the man who had called forth the creature. My name is Victor Frankenstein, the man smiled. He called forth a monster that screamed and rushed toward Kazuki, slamming its spike, covered fist. Sing, Benihime. Kazuki swung his blade, and the two blows collided, resulting in a Ryotsu explosion. A still, smoking crater where the two strikes had collided was visible as the Ryotsu explosion subsided. Pulling its fist back, the monster snarled and crept back toward its master. Kazuki, meanwhile, had scowled as he gazed at the person in front of him, this Victor Frankenstein. What a strange name. The aforementioned Victor Frankenstein, on the other hand, smirked when he saw Kazuki's thoughtful expression. He opened his mouth and said, judging by the look on your face, I am assuming you are contemplating one of three things. He held up his hand with one finger outstretched and said, 1. You are contemplating how it is I summoned my doll. 2. You are contemplating how my doll stopped your attack in the first place. And 3. You are contemplating what I want with this child. He emphasized by bringing the unconscious Naruto up by his hair, revealing him to Kazuki, while Victor grinned broadly and said, Wasuke Urahara? How did you? Kazuki asked, his eyes widening. Victor laughed. Oh, don't be prideful. You may think you are a sneaky old man, but I know who you are, former head of the Department of Research and Development. With narrowed eyes, Kazuki turned to face Victor and appeared to grunt, you seem to know me, but I don't know you. Victor grinned. Ah, is that so? I find that shocking. My name after all is quite a giveaway, or are you not a heavy reader, Mr. Urahara? Heavy reader, Kazuki scowled at his statement. How could his name be related to that? H had read nearly every book ever written, whether it was fiction or non-fiction, and Victor Frankenstein only appeared in. As he grasped the boy's hair, Kazuki's eyes widened and he gazed at Victor, who had now resumed allowing Naruto's limp form to remain on the ground. No way, and he. Victor sighs and presses his hair behind his ear, saying, though the book hardly does me credit. Victor holds up a hand and says, oh, it seems that you do read after all. Yes, Kazuki Urahara. You are looking upon the one and only Victor Frankenstein. Kazuki gazed at this thing, who claimed to be Victor Frankenstein from the book Frankenstein, but there was no way that this could be true. He was a fictional character who had witnessed some bizarre things in his life. Kazuki's face caught his eye. I see that you do not believe me, not surprising. After all, I am supposedly a living character from a book older than any human can read, albeit said book is based off a myth she heard from the local drunk. While he scowled and prepared his blade, Kazuki looked at Naruto, who was still being held captive by the madman in front of him. He then turned his attention to the enormous, festering monster in front of him, which was merely staring, seemingly awaiting orders from his master. As if noticing his glance at the monstrosity, Victor said, I see you are enamored with my doll. Doll? Kazuki asked, glancing back at him with a questioning expression. Victor laughed, yes, my doll. Such a beauty, isn't it? To be honest, it was my doll which inspired me to seek the arts of science, and become a great doctor and scientist. He grimaced, as opposed to what you are now. As Victor went on, Kazuki scowled and gripped his blade more tightly. Such a pathetic existence. You yourself were once a great doctor, a scientist unlike anything that your precious Seirei had ever seen, but look at you now. You're nothing more than some hack running a candy store as the Seirei errand boy. Kazuki appears to be laughing at this. Well, it just so happens I like my job. Certainly better than your gig, some crazy scientist whose only notable feature is that disgusting thing you call your doll. Oh Kazuki, you pathetic little man. You call yourself a scientist, yet crack jokes about something you know nothing about. You know as little about the human anatomy and biology as you do a practical field to work in. Really Kazuki, making toys? Victor appears to laugh as well, before the laughter explodes. Smiles Kazuki, toys? I shall have you know that they are marvels to be enjoyed by its wielder. Besides, My own creations never went on a killing spree. Tell me, doctor, how many of your loved ones did your creation kill? Or was the book misleading on that too? You bloody hypocrite. Victor's eyes appeared to turn bloodshot from the anger gushing from him, and his smile transformed into an angry snarl. The former head of the science division had to duck out of the way to avoid being crushed by the monster of flesh's wrath as it roared and swung at Kazuki in response to his evident rage. Kazuki observed that the beast appeared to lack coordination as he continued to avoid it. Victor, meanwhile, had his eyes closed and his teeth clenched, his muscles tensing as he breathed in and out. Kazuki took note of this and had to move aside as the creature swung at him. It was much more difficult to avoid this one. No matter how high and mighty you act, Kazuki, you will never be anything more than a failure, to your lieutenant, to your comrades. In fact, the whole mess with the Hogyoku is your fault to begin with, Victor said, letting his muscles relax and running a hand through his hair before turning to face Kazuki. As he heard this, Kazuki clenched his teeth, but then it hit him. How had Victor known all of that? Gah! Kazuki's thoughts were interrupted by a cry of anger, and he turned to see where it came from. Soifan, who had dragged herself out of her previous state and was now rushing at Victor with bloodlust in her eyes, caught his attention. Victor acknowledged Soifan as well and scowled, saying, "Foolish prideful child." He prepared himself in a stance while clutching Naruto's still, unconscious hair. Leaping at Victor, Soifan snarled and swung her leg in a whirling roundhouse. She swung her other foot towards Victor's exposed side, but Victor had to dodge as she blocked her attempted strike. Soifan swung her shikai at him after landing on the ground. This was easily blocked by him, and he sent her sprawling back with a front kick. In an attempt to avoid striking Naruto, Soifan swiftly straightened herself and swung her shikai once more, slashing wildly. The enormous beast of flesh attempted to assist its master at the same moment, but Kazuki attacked the beast with all of his might. "I'll kill you. I will fucking kill you," Soifan hissed angrily as she charged at him, her shikai poised to strike. Victor anticipated this attack. It was obvious that her rage was impairing her fighting abilities. Aiming for his throat, Soifan launched her assault, only to have her arm become totally numb. Soifan's eyes widened momentarily as she looked sideways and saw Victor's hand grab her arm in mid-strike. Then she felt a huge blow to her abdomen, which threw her back a few meters. With a sly, childish smirk, Victor pulls his hand back and asks, "Ah, did the little Shinigami fall down and go boom?" Soifan moaned as she attempted to stand up. For some reason, the arm Victor had taken was useless. She felt nothing at all as she attempted to move it. She glanced at Victor. Her arm must have been injured by him. However, how? He grinned and said, "I won't tell you how I disabled your arm, but let's just say that when you live as long as I have, you pick up a few tricks." Well, his smirk darkened even more. "I see you are confused, dearie. Not surprising. You Shinigami are all so very arrogant, believing yourselves to be unstoppable." The fact that Soifan was ambidextrous was undoubtedly advantageous as she snarled as she attempted to stand up and prepared her Zanpakuto too, which moved to her other arm. Sighing, "It is becoming increasingly annoying to fight you with a single arm, Lightnum." The creature that was choking Kazuki by the throat turned to face its master. "Bring the boy to the rendezvous point," said Victor. The creature appeared to nod before extending its arm, which trembled and pulsed as metal pipes and gears protruded from it at a startling rate before tearing away from the creature. The pile of flesh and machine that resulted gurgled, twisted, and warped, resembling a spider with extensions that resembled mechanical arms. Before starting to scuttle up the wall and over the rooftops, the monstrosity reached forward and grabbed Naruto. "Naruto!" Soifan exclaimed, but she was too stunned by the beast to react in time, and by the time she did, the beast was leaping over the rooftops. Soifan ran after the monstrous creature. Kazuki, meanwhile, had cut off a few of the monster's fingers, which had allowed him to escape. Kazuki sneered at Victor while coughing as the monster crept back to defend its master, but he noticed Victor's smirk and gave him a questioning glance. He had witnessed Soifan pursuing the monster and the monster creating that monstrous clone of his. He was aware of Soifan's speed. Yoruichi was the only creature he knew of that was faster than her, and he honestly didn't think the creature could outrun her, but Victor was grinning. Was he so conceited or egotistical that he believed Soifan would never catch up to it? Or did he wish for her to catch up? Soifan waited say. He cried, but the monster slammed into him, causing him to crash into the nearby building. Victor's smirk grew more sinister as his eyes drifted in the direction Soifan had just gone. Alongside Soifan, since Soifan had run after the beast that had captured her son and her bloodlust was impairing her judgment, she would not have heard Kazuki even if he had completed his statement. She ought to have been more aware of her surroundings as she approached the beast. realized it was much too simple to catch up to her, and realized it was guiding her through a clear choke point, but she failed to do so. Rather, her entire attention was on the beast that was holding her son. As the monster cornered itself in a back alley, she leapt off the walls and charged at it. She lunged toward the beast, prepared to defeat it, only to feel herself punched through a solid brick wall and smashed in the side of the face. The creature she was pursuing made a sound as a figure emerged from the darkness. A woman with long, silky blonde hair held up in an elaborate style with an ornamental comb studded with kanji stood in front of the hole in the wall created by Soifan's collision. She was obviously of Japanese descent. She was dressed in a long, royal kimono with sakura blossoms and swans on it. A silk rope was used to secure an elaborate katana at her side. The beast's gears hissed and whirred as it scuttled over to the new figure. The woman gave the beast the signal to leave by jerking her head upwards while looking down at it. After a brief moment of buzzing, the beast quickly fled, Naruto strapped to its back. In the meantime, the woman walked through the hole in the wall toward the fallen Soifan, her eyes cold and her face stoic. Soifan was moaning as she attempted to get up but had so far been unsuccessful. What the devil had struck her? She felt as though a freaking boulder had sucker punched her. Soifan was forced to grasp at a hand that encircled her throat and raised her off the ground like a piece of plywood, preventing her from trying any further. Soifan's eyes opened to look at her attacker as she gasped in agony as her throat was crushed. The woman in front of her had a stoic expression on her face and eyes that were so cold that they made her body shiver. She maintained this stoic expression while reaching for the katana on her belt with her other hand, which was hidden by her long kimono. Soifan's eyes briefly met the blade as she made a stronger attempt to break free, only to be shocked by what she saw as her throat became even more constricted. There was a complete stone gauntlet where the girl's left arm should have been, but she was unsure if it was a replacement for her potentially amputated arm or just a gauntlet. Know this as you die Shinigami, that your race, your precious Seirei, brought this all on themselves. The woman's katana was halfway out of its sheath when she said, "We shall be as the wave crashing upon the shores, unyielding, unbreaking." The blade was only a third of its length left in. "We shall cleanse your filth from this world, and a new dawn shall break as your race's ashes are crushed underfoot." The woman skillfully spun the blade in her hand and extended it outwards. The sharp end turned away from its master. "As you perish, know your executioner, Princess Mizer." She flicked her wrist and swung the blade at Soifan. Even as she struggled, Soifan knew there was no way out of this, but she persisted in struggling as time seemed to slow down. She stared in shock at the blade as the cutting edge swung towards her. The blade was about to touch her skin, ripping through her as the now named Mizer continued to swing, her face as cold as ever. "Zeig Dick. Gerda." Her katana clatters off to the side as she is flung away from the defenseless Shinigami, only to experience a horrible burning sensation. Soifan fell forward, gasping for air, only to be stopped in mid-fall as she exhaled. When she looked around to see who had caught her, she noticed that Orihime. "Soifan, are you alright?" Orihime asked, glancing at her. "How many fingers am I holding up?" she asked, holding up her hand anxiously, several fingers out. Simultaneously, Mizer quietly pushed herself to her feet, jerking her head to the side as she did so and turning to face the group, which included Ichigo, Orihime, Chad, and Yoshino, Mizer said in an emotionless tone as she turned to face Yoshino Soma. With a floating mass of flames and limbs by her side, Yoshino scowled at Mizer and said, "Mizer." Chad stood protectively in front of Soifan as Orihime and Ichigo helped him up, his face turned toward Mizer and Yoshino, who were looking down at each other. Initially, Yoshino said, "Mizer, what are you doing?" With a stoic tone that chilled everyone to their bones, Mizer said, "It does not concern you, traitor. You're serving that monster Karya. I already know this. What I want to know is Karya's plan." Yoshino growled angrily. "You would know if you had not betrayed us, Yoshino," Mizer said in a quiet voice as she approached her katana and lifted it from the ground before sheathing it. Her voice reverberated to the marrow with the same chill that chilled everyone's bones. Yoshino snarled and prepared to respond. "Where is my son, you bitch?" After hearing the statement, Yoshino turned to look behind her and saw Soifan standing up, holding her arm as she limped forward, her eyes full of murderous intent. Mizer looked at her and asked, "Your son?" Her tone was cold as well, but there was a tinge of curiosity. "Yes, my son, you miserable sack of shit. The one on that monster's back. Where is my son?" Soifan yelled, extending her shikai while letting her other arm drop limp to her side. She brought her hand to her chin as Mizer gazed at her. Her son, Karya. Mizer considered the implications, then her icy pupils flashed with realization before returning to their icy tone. "Answer me, you bitch," growled Soifan. With a look of approval, Mizer said, "You're never going to see your son again." With a furious expression, Soifan exclaimed, "What did you just say?" Coldly spoke Mizer, "You are never going to see your son ever again, Shinigami. Victor's doll has already gotten too far ahead, you will never be able to track it by the time it gets to the rendezvous point, and even if you do find the rendezvous point, by the time you find it, your boy will be in Karia's hands, you will never find him." Her demeanor matched her demeanor. "You're gonna tell me where my son is if I have to make you scream?" Soifan yelled at Mizer before anyone could stop her, her eyes widening before her face contorted into one of pure hatred. "Wait," Yoshino said, failing to seize her. As Soifan charged at her, Mizer stood motionless, her hand gripping her katana's hilt. Soifan hurled herself at Mizer, intending to inflict excruciating pain with her shikai. Mizer quickly took her katana out of its sheath and struck Soifan, who was unable to stop the blow. However, Mizer missed her mark because Soifan was shoved aside, and her katana instead slashed open a humanoid mass of fire with flames in place of legs. "Gerda!" yelled Yoshino. As the flames escaped from its body, the now named Gerda collapsed to the ground. Sheathed her blade and turned to go. Mizer backed up after staring at the fallen creature in front of her and saying, "Be grateful I have no more time to waste with you." She had wasted too much time. Shikai raised, and Mizer snapped her head to the side just in time to see Soifan rushing in her direction. "You're not going anywhere," she said. Mizer's kimono spun with her as she quickly swerved out of Soifan's strike. Her eyes widened in shock as Soifan turned to attack once more. Mizer had left. In the meantime, Victor's monstrous creature, which had twisted its missing limb into a mass of electrically arcing Tesla coils and mechanical gears, was struck by Kazuki's blade. The Shinigami quickly delivered a counterattack after the monster roared and swung its composed arm at Kazuki, blocking the strike. While all of this was going on, Victor scowled and looked around, asking himself, "Where is she? She should have come here by now." He turned back to face Kazuki, who was making progress against his doll. After he had to avoid a blow from the monster, Kazuki skidded back. The creature appeared to be standing motionless and turned to face its master, who was obviously lost in thought. Kazuki prepared his blade and narrowed his eyes for the next attack by the monster. When the monster noticed this, it ducked down, preparing to attack. Lightning. The monster turned back to Victor, who was apparently annoyed and rubbing his forehead. He snapped his eyes at the beast and said, "Lightning, it looks like she won't be showing up. He is no longer useful to us. Kill him." After nodding its head, the monster roared and charged at Kazuki, swinging its Tesla arm at him while his whole body arced with electricity. Sing Benihime. Kazuki's Zanpakuto 2 flared, releasing a burst of red energy that collided with the easily broken Tesla arm. After being flung violently against a wall, Kazuki is unable to move and finds himself imprisoned in a crater the size of his own body with spiderweb cracks extending out in all directions. The monster slammed the Tesla coil arm into Kazuki's abdomen just as he was ready to drop to the ground from the crater. Looking at his monster, Victor nodded his head and said, "Lightning, finish him." Massive arcs of electricity erupted in response, encircling the beast and spreading to the Tesla coil that was pinning Kazuki. Kazuki was flailing as the electricity pierced his body, the pain growing more intense by the moment. Smash! The beast was about to strike again when a strong blow knocked it off Kazuki and sent it screaming toward its master. Victor's eyes grew wide, and he took swift action to avoid his pet's collision with the adjacent building, which caused the wall to collapse entirely. Kazuki had collapsed to the ground, coughing and shaking from the body damage caused by the electric shocks. "Hey Kazuki, you gonna lay there all day?" As he slowly raised his head to see who had spoken, Kazuki's eyes grew wide. The smiling figure of Yoruichi Shiwan was standing in front of him. "Well, you gonna answer me or what?" grinned Yoruichi. Kazuki pushed himself up and couldn't help but smirk. "Yoruichi Shiwan, I did not anticipate your arrival here." Kazuki and Yoruichi both looked in Victor's direction, who had straightened up after avoiding his pet's impending fall. The monster was getting to its feet at the same moment, snarling as it prepared to strike. "Do I know you?" Yoruichi asked him, looking at him bewildered. "Unlikely, but the fact remains that I know you, and what you are capable of." Victor snorted and dismissed the idea, looking up at them. "Knowing this, and with Kazuki's abilities, if I were to try and fight both of you, too much time would be wasted, and currently I have little to spare." "Oh, running home to mommy?" smirked Yoruichi. Victor scowled and extended his hand, snapping his fingers quickly, saying, "No, a tactical retreat." Boom! Causing a clash of metal and flesh as his beast exploded. A boiled flesh pipe swung at Yoruichi, causing her eyes to widen. "Shit!" she exclaimed, and she leapt aside. Kazuki was in a similar situation, avoiding large pieces of burning flesh and gears. Kazuki followed suit as Yoruichi leapt behind a shattered building fragment. The explosion subsided after a few seconds, and the metal and flesh ceased to fly. The entire area was covered in burning flesh and metallic parts when Yoruichi slowly peered behind the broken building piece they had hidden behind. However, there was no sign of Victor or his monster. She had a quick method for identifying any indication of spiritual pressure. "It's safe, he's gone, so is that monster of his," Yoruichi said, turning to face Kazuki. "Damn it," Kazuki said, getting up and glancing around. Victor was gone. "What are you upset about? He's gone. We are safe for the moment, isn't that a good thing?" Yoruichi asked, quirking an eye in bewilderment. Gazing at Yoruichi, Kazuki said, "He took Naruto." Yoruichi's eyes went wide with shock, saying, "W. What?" She was unable to believe what she had heard. Kazuki replied, "Yes, he summoned that monster of his, and a piece of it broke off before he sent said piece to take Naruto elsewhere. Soifun chased after it." With a seemingly relieved sigh, Yoruichi said, "Then Naruto is safe. Soifun is too fast for whatever it was that left." "I doubt Soifun made it to Naruto," Kazuki scowled. "It was probably a trap." With wide eyes, Yoruichi asked, "What do you?" When Yoruichi sensed a huge surge in spiritual pressure close by, very close, she was silenced. Kazuki scowled, saying, "Yoruichi, we have to." In the same direction that Soifun had gone just a short while before. Urahara.san, when Kazuki heard agonized moans coming from beneath his shop's debris and noticed a big hand sticking out of it, he snapped his head to the side. "Tessai!" Kazuki exclaimed as he rushed over and began attempting to remove the shattered building fragments from him. As Yoruichi was about to assist him, Kazuki yelled, "No, go help Soifun." She went in that direction, and pointed indiscriminately in the direction Soifun had gone. "Hurry," he said, lifting the debris off Tessai, who then started to assist. Just as Yoruichi was about to object, the Ryatsu suddenly increased even more. "They better be okay when I get back, Kazuki." "Baka." She scowled and nodded to Kazuki before jumping in the direction Soifun had gone, directly toward the spiking Ryatsu. In the meantime, as her mind processed what had happened, Soifun's gaze remained focused on the spot where Mizer had been standing only a few seconds earlier. Yoshino dismissed Gerda at the same moment that Orihime, Chad, and Ichigo approached her. Orihime put a gentle hand on her shoulder and asked, "Soifun?" N.No. No, Soifun screamed as she continued to stare at the spot where Mizer had been just seconds before. Her pupils quickly dilated as her eyes became bloodshot. She started to look around, trying to sense anything. No, where did she go? Where did she fucking go? Soifun started to tear up the area around her, flinging bricks and debris aside in an attempt to find any indication of where she had gone. As Chad and Ichigo approached her, Orihime gazed at her. "Soifun, what is wrong?" said Chad. As she lifted up some old carpets, Soifun ignored him. It was obvious that they were in an old warehouse. Soifun was trying to figure out how Mizer might have gotten away. "Soifun, what are you doing?" Ichigo scowled. Soifun stopped looking, but he found nothing, no indication of Mizer's path. She had managed to get away. She had lost the only clue she had to locate her son. As they gathered around Soifun, Yoshino asked, what is going on here?" Yoshino's voice caused Soifun's eyes to open, and she slowly turned to face her. "What are you?" Soifun stared at Yoshino, who just stared back in bewilderment. Boom! When a huge spike or Ryatsu shot out from Soifun with such force that the ground cracked and debris flew outward, Yoshino was silenced. Ichigo, Chad, and Orihime somehow managed to stay upright, but they had been pushed back a few feet. Soifun bared her teeth and twisted her lips into a snarl, her eyes full of bloodthirsty rage. Soifun was in front of Yoshino before she could do anything, lifting her off the ground with her other arm still numbly hanging at her side and putting her hand around Yoshino's throat. "Where is he?" Soifun sneered and slammed Yoshino into the wall behind her. "What are you?" Yoshino gasped, but Soifun's tighter squeeze silenced him. After gathering herself, Orihime, who had been frozen in shock, ran to Soifun and attempted to yank her away from Yoshino. Though they were more successful than Orihime at removing Soifun from Yoshino, Chad and Ichigo still squeezed Yoshino's throat. "Let go of me. She knows Naruto is," Soifun said, attempting to shake the three off of her. "What?" Orihime seemed to loosen her hold as the three of them felt their eyes widen. Soifun grumbled with rage, My son was kidnapped by somebody who could summon a monster. Used the term, Zyge Dick, to summon the damn thing. Just like what she did with that, flaming thing. She knows something, and I am going to find out if I have to tear her limb from. Soifun. Soifun paused and turned her head slightly to see Yoruichi looking down at her sternly. Soifun, release her now. If she knows where Naruto is, then killing her would be counterproductive. After giving her a quick glance and turning back to Yoshino, Soifun let go of him as he gasped for air. Ichigo gave Yoshino a hand up and gave her time to catch her breath. A few minutes later, as an irritated Soifun tried and failed to sense her child no matter how far she stretched her senses, Ichigo said, "Okay Yoshino. I know you are not well after Soifun attacked you, but we are short on time. I need you to tell Soifun and Yoruichi," pointing to Soifun and Yoruichi, "everything that you told us." "She just attacked me. Why should I tell her anything?" Yoshino glared at Ichigo. "On this occasion," Orihime said, "because one of your race just kidnapped her son." After Yoshino's eyes widened, he turned to look at Soifun, whose eyes hardened as they locked. Yoshino sighed and said, "My name is Yoshino Soma. I am what is known as a Bount." Soifun and Yoruichi stared at her bewildered. According to Yoshino, a Bount is a unique race of human which appeared thousands of years ago. To this day we have no idea how, or why we exist. But because of one ability in particular, we could never, nor will ever be able to exist in any society. We are immortal. Soifun and Yoruichi were both taken aback by this. Yoshino looked between them all. "Yes, we are immortal, but we can still die and be killed. We just cannot die from old age, and in addition we are slightly more durable than normal humans, so we are much harder to kill. We are also able to interact with the spiritual world, which leads to one of our other abilities, the ability to consume pluses, human souls." She saw the shock on Soifun and Yoruichi's face at this. Most Bounts consume the souls of already dead mortals. However, there are those Bounts who will consume the souls of still living humans, but on the most part, there is a stigma against eating living souls. I myself don't do it because it just seems wrong. But that stigma was there long before I came along. I don't know if they all felt the way I do or if there is something else. But for a while it seemed as though consuming living souls was a stigma, until now at least. She lowered her head, and then looked back up. "The final ability, the one she saw," she said, indicating to Soifun, "is the ability to summon a familiar, a doll, something akin to the Zanpakuto of a Shinigami." "How do you know of the Shinigami Zanpakuto?" Yoruichi scowled. Sighing, Yoshino said, "Kariya has ways of finding things out, even I am not aware how it is he knows." Yoruichi gave a nod. "We know what you are," Soifun said sharply, "but I don't really care. What I want to know is where my son is. That son of a bitch Victor took my son and—" "Did you say Victor?" Yoshino asked, his eyes widening. As he gazed at her, Soifun said, "Yes, Victor Frankenstein." With wide eyes, Yoshino exclaimed, "Shit," and slammed her fist into the wall, slightly cracking it. "Damn it, Kariya." "Kariya. You keep mentioning him, but who is he?" asked Ichigo, with a quirked eye. Yoshino looked at him. "My ex-husband and the leader of a tribe of Bounts. The tribe I used to be a part of. Victor is also a member of this tribe, and is a particularly genius scientist. Whatever Victor wants with her son, Kariya has something to do with it." Yoruichi put a hand on Soifun's shoulder just as she opened her mouth to speak, temporarily cutting her off. "Rather than that," Yoruichi said, "do you know where they would take Naruto?" "Maybe," Yoshino said, glancing at her. "In the meantime." A huge estate with a number of elaborate gardens encircling it, and a big, elaborate metal fence with a single gate in front of the only entrance to the expansive estate. A tiny suburb with numerous twisting streets encircled the estate. Two figures were seen strolling down one of them. Mizer and Victor, who were conversing at the moment. "Kariya will not be happy that you could not secure Yoshino Victor. He wanted her back very badly." Mizer was staring at Victor. "I miscalculated, based on what events had occurred, what options were available, and Yoshino's apparent knowledge, which might I add was obtained through a long and extensive investigation of her property and careful knowledge obtained from the rest of us. I calculated she would have gone to Kazuki's shop for help. Besides, there was a far more pressing concern than Kariya's bed warmer." Victor tilted his head toward her. "Speaking of which, was Lightnum able to escape with the boy?" Mizer replied, "Yes, I managed to stop the Shinigami from intercepting Lightnum. Lightnum should have arrived at the rendezvous point by the time any help for her arrived." Victor looked at him. "I meant to ask you, who was it that managed to drive you off, Mizer? Normally you do not back down from a fight, yet you did. Why?" "It was Yoshino among a few others," Mizer said calmly, turning to face him with a stoic, uninterested expression. "Perhaps if you had lingered a few minutes more, you could have captured her." As they approached the main gate and the fence enclosing the estate, Victor turned his head back and said, perhaps, or perhaps she would not have arrived at all, and I would have lost in a fight against Kazuki and Yoruichi. The variables change, and I had to perform a tactical retreat. Yoshino is not worth the risk of our plans falling apart, no matter what Kariya says. We both know Kariya's strength, so it's best not to let him hear you say that, Mizer said, turning her head back to the gates. With a small smile, Victor said, perhaps, perhaps not. Victor turned his head as they stood in front of the gates and said, Lightnum, bring him. The beast that had captured Naruto darted out from the shadows of a nearby building, stood in front of Victor, and bowed just enough for Victor to seize Naruto by the hair. Good work, Lightnum. You are dismissed, Victor grinned. The beast instantly transformed into a mass of spiritual energy, which Victor quickly absorbed. Victor and Mizer were walking toward the estate when Mizer pushed open the gate. Alongside Uryu, there was nothing new about Uryu being bound to the chair. Actually, the only thing that had changed was that Fenrir was now protecting him rather than Ryo and Ugaki. Uryu persisted in attempting to escape his restraints. Fenrir spoke out, it is pointless trying, Quincy boy, we Bounts have lived a long time, and have had practice over time to learn many tricks, and how to improve upon them. You, being an inferior human, have no possibility of breaking those. Oh, and you expect me to just sit here and wait for you to do Kami knows what to me? Uryu gave him a cold, ineffectual glare. He sighed, it would be preferable to your constant struggling to prevent the inevitable. He complained, much less patience would be wasted on you. Like I care how much patience you have, Uryu glared at him. Since I am the one protecting you, you better not provoke me, Quincy. After all, I can always just say you were trying to escape after I break all of your ribs, Fenrir said, glaring at Uryu. Uryu yelled at him, oh yeah, kick a man when he can't defend himself, is that how all of you Bounts work, or just the cowardly ones? Uryu was growled at by Fenrir, who said, mind your manners, Quincy. Uryu sighed. Why should I? Some street thug is about as good as the dirt beneath my feet, you slimy sack of shish. The snarling Fenrir quickly lifted Uryu off the ground, chair and all. Fenrir clamped down on Uryu's throat, causing him to gasp pitifully for air. Listen very carefully, Quincy. The only reason you are still breathing is because currently we have use of you. The moment that is no longer the case, I will personally gut you myself. Fenrir leaned in and dug his nails into the chair. He dropped Uryu, who was coughing, casually, and the chair managed to stay intact. Creak. When Fenrir heard a door open, he turned to see Victor and Mizer entering. He nodded his head in recognition of Naruto, still unconscious, being held by Victor's hair. As he entered the prison cell, Victor yelled, Fenrir, as much as you would like to kill the Quincy, wait until after we're done with him. He then opened a smaller cell nearby and tossed Naruto in carelessly. When the recuperated Uryu saw this, his eyes widened and he said, Naruto. He gritted his teeth and looked up at Victor, asking, what the hell do you want with us? As Victor walked out of the cell, he casually said, don't fret, Quincy, you will know soon enough. After that, well, I can't say you will live long enough for it to matter anyways. Victor glanced at Uryu. Uryu's eyes grew wide as he fixed his gaze on Fenrir, who started to click his tongue nonchalantly, seemingly in a state of patient waiting. What on earth were they going to do, beyond the cell? Both Victor and Mizer were silent as they left the cell and made their way down a single hallway. Victor, how nice of you to return. However, both halted when they noticed Kariya smirking as he waited for them at the end of the hallway. Did you doubt I would, Kariya? Do you have so little faith in my abilities? Victor asked with a nod of his head. When he started to look at his hand, Kariya chuckled softly and said, I wonder, after all, I did not see Yoshino with you when you arrived, Victor. Victor breathed a sigh of relief. As much as you would have loved to have your precious bed warmer back, the fact is that variables change. One thing was of greater importance, and so the potential of reacquiring Yoshino effectively died. Mind what you refer to my wife as Victor, Kariya growled, erasing the smirk from his face. With a glance at Kariya, Victor said, last I checked, it was ex-wife Kariya. Growling, Kariya said, I suggest you. Victor yelled, I suggest you remember who you were talking to, Kariya. Victor Frankenstein. Specifically Dr. Victor Frankenstein. Currently the only one on this planet besides Kazuki Urahara who has the means, desire, and capability to aid you and the rest of the Bounts on their quest for revenge. Lose me, and your chance of getting revenge will have only one possibility. Kariya clenched his jaw and looked away. I highly recommend sending Ugaki down. I am willing to bet those pesky lil whelps are on their way. Victor smirked as he walked forward, saying, good, now if you will excuse me, I must make my final preparations. He then passed Kariya and started down the stairs. Mizer, have Ugaki ready for our guests should they arrive. The plan must go off without a hitch, Kariya said, gritting his teeth and then snapping his head in the direction of Mizer, who had stayed with the same stoic expression. After bowing, Mizer said, "Yes, Lord Kariya." She then went back to find Ugaki. Before Victor left on his own, Kariya glared in the direction he had gone. Inside his mindscape, with Naruto in the back of Naruto's mind, he sat in a chilly darkness and looked around, as though he was waiting for an escape. As if mocking him, Naruto looked around and said, "Hello." His words reverberated, "Is anyone there?" "Ka-chan, where are you?" Naruto said, looking down and holding his legs close to him. His eyes started to water, and he tightened his embrace as his words reverberated. Alongside Soifun as they followed Yoshino, Soifun was jumping over buildings with Orihime on her back. A voice reverberated in Soifun's mind as she landed on another building, making her heart tighten. "Where are you, Ka-chan?" Orihime noticed that Soifun stumbled for a moment. "Soifun, are you alright?" Before continuing to jump across buildings, Soifun scowled and said, No, I am not." Orihime sighed as he gave her a worried look. "I'm coming, Sochi. I'm coming, my baby," Soifun said as he looked straight ahead. The blonde child of Soifun sat with his legs pressed close to him in the icy darkness of Naruto's mind, looking around fearfully, alone, with tears pouring from each eye. He rasped, sniffing, Ka-chan, as he sobbed. The darkness seemed to mock him by echoing his cries. Holding his body closer to himself, Naruto sobbed as he continued to call out and heard his voice repeated repeatedly. Ka-chan, help me," he said, biting his lip as tears streamed down his cheeks. Pathetic. When Naruto's eyes opened, his head jerked upwards and snapped around, moving so quickly that his neck cracked from the abrupt movement. The pale-skinned, yellow-eyed version of himself, his inner hollow, was standing behind him. Oturan gazing at Oturan, Naruto stumbled, "What?" Sneering, Oturan said, "I said pathetic. You are so helpless that you are unable to defend yourself from capture. Are you ready to part ways with Ka-chan?" As he got to his feet, Naruto's eyes grew wide. Never. Then demonstrate it. Prove that you have the will to fight, that you are willing to do whatever it takes to be with Ka-chan forever. Oturan snapped sharply, his golden eyes gleaming intensely. Gazing at Oturan, Naruto sniffed, How? Then Oturan scowled and simply extended his arm and said, "Take my hand, brother." As Naruto gazed at Oturan, he reached out and took his hand, trembling just a little. As if a huge sheet were being unrolled from all around them, the world started to disperse and change in an instant, and they ended up in front of a huge cave with two enormous statues of dragons on either side of the entrance. Alongside Uryu, the Bount had not been lying. These bonds had been executed quite skillfully, and Uryu bit his lip as he pulled at his restraints, doubting that anyone, not even skilled soldiers, could escape them. Uryu raised his head, took a quick look at the Bount that was still watching over him, and then turned to face Naruto, who was still unconscious on the floor of his cell. He didn't think either Naruto or he would make it through the aftermath of whatever the Bounts were planning. Uryu attempted to pull at his bonds in the hope that he would be able to release them. He felt the bonds tighten as he moved his wrists. He recognized that texture, though, and his eyes widened as he felt the bonds themselves. He closed his eyes and inhaled deeply, fighting the urge to smirk. He might have figured out how to get out of this situation. Alongside Soifun, Orihime was strapped to Yoruichi's back as she shot after Yoshino, her eyes steely as she leapt over rooftops and chimneys to keep up with her, while Ichigo took up the rear and Soifun leapt over the buildings. Soifun was gradually losing what little patience she still had because Yoshino was slower than her and Yoshino was the only one who knew where her baby had been taken. "Could you move faster, damn it?" Soifun yelled at Yoshino. She snarled viciously as she spoke. "I am not a Shinigami, even though I am stronger than the typical human, but I am still Yoshino said, turning to face her. "Be careful." Her eyes widened, and Yoshino snapped her head around, avoiding a chimney by swerving to the right, but she moved too slowly, clipping her shoulder and skidding across the rooftop below before crashing into another chimney nearby. Orihime ran to Yoshino and knelt beside her after Soifun bounded to the rooftop and led her off her back. "Are you okay?" Yoshino clutched her shoulder and moaned in agony. I think so," she hissed, attempting to move her arm. With a frown, Orihime carefully took Yoshino's arm and winced when she noticed a noticeable break. "You broke your arm when you fell." Orihime got up and said, "I'll fix it, just sit still for the moment. In the meantime, Soifun was clenching her teeth and pacing back and forth when she suddenly looked at Yoshino and said, "Tell me where we are going. If I have to, I will go there myself." Ichigo landed immediately after Yoruichi, who landed on the roof and let Chad down. "If that was possible I would tell you, but," Yoshino hissed, turning to face Soifun. "In order for me to heal your arm, could you please stop moving for a moment?" A field of energy encircled Yoshino as Orihime said, "Soden Kishin. I reject." She held out her hands in a stern manner. As Orihime healed Yoshino, Soifun clenched her fists tightly and gritted her teeth, looking in the direction they were going. They were on their way to the biggest and most intricate of his estates, the one where practically all of his operations were conducted, and if Yoshino's statement was accurate, this carry was located at one of his numerous estates. The majority of them. This implied that there was a sufficient chance that Naruto would not be present for this to have been a waste of time. Hopefully, it wasn't. The mindscape of Naruto. With their hands still clasped together, Naruto and Oturan gazed up at the entrance to the cave. Oturan nodded while grinning and glancing at Naruto. Naruto gave him a quick glance before nodding slowly in return. With a smile in return, Oturan practically pulled Naruto into the cave. The statue's eyes glowed as the two entered, and the vines growing over the cave created a shimmering haze. For what seemed like hours, Oturan and Naruto stumbled in, their hands never leaving one another, until at last they arrived at the innermost sanctum, which was home to the two dragons. But this time, they were waiting for them, both of them sitting on the edge with a view of the vast cavern far below. "Well, I was beginning to wonder if you were ever going to come," said the black dragon, whose scales were darker than night. The dragon looked down at them slowly and bared his teeth while snarling softly. The black dragon hissed at them as the white dragon, with scales whiter than light, bit it, saying, "Silence, they're here, and that's all that matters. So, what brings you back, Naruto, Oturan?" The dragon snorted before slowly craning its head towards Naruto and Oturan, its eyes glimmering with what seemed to be softness. The dragon gave Oturan a questioning look. After adjusting its reclining position and huffing, the black dragon said, "Have you finally arrived to give us orders, whelps?" "Yes," Oturan said, glancing at the dragons. "We need our power because our mother is in danger while we are unconscious and we can no longer be a burden to her." The black dragon appeared to grin and say, "Good." It turned to face the white dragon and gave a soft snarl, while the white dragon appeared surprised. As they gazed at Naruto and Oturan, the white dragon merely snorted and then nodded back. "Before you may wield us, you must know us," the white dragon said. Naruto listened intently and stared in awe. Speaking, the white dragon said, "My name is..." "W what?" Naruto froze for a second. "And my name is," said the black dragon. With dejected eyes, Naruto gazed at them both and said, I didn't, why couldn't I hear you?" "I heard him." Oturan pointed at the black dragon, and Naruto snapped his head in his direction, his eyes widening. What?" In response, Oturan pointed to the white dragon and said, "I didn't hear him." He then pointed to the black dragon and said, "But I did hear him." "What is his?" Naruto turned to face Oturan after glancing at the black dragon, who appeared to be observing him with interest. When the black dragon's claws suddenly crashed into the ground in front of Naruto, he growled, "You are not deserving of hearing my name if you are unable to hear it yourself." The dragon snorted and extended its claws toward Oturan, huffing before returning his attention to Naruto. "However, he is worthy," the dragon said. "What are you doing?" The white dragon yelled as it abruptly extended its claws and grabbed the black dragon's. "I am bestowing his rightful power," the black dragon growled and hissed in the white dragon's face. "Naruto does not yet know our names, he is not," the white dragon snorted back. "In addition, if we are to wait for Naruto to be ready, it might take years. That is, if they live past tonight. Or have you forgotten their current predicament? But Oturan does, at least my name does, and he is ready." He gave the white dragon a snort in return. "Our power works in tandem for a reason. If he loses control," the white dragon hissed, stopping the statement mid-sentence. In response, the black dragon snarled, "I understand the danger of using my own strength, but the bigger danger is doing nothing and they both perish or, worse, go into oblivion." The white dragon snarled and looked down as it flinched back and then slowly backed away after a few moments. With a sigh, the black dragon turned back to face Oturan and grabbed him, slamming his hands into them with a single black sphere of light that protruded from his claws. Alongside Uryu as he slowly worked at the threads of the rope that bound him, Uryu struggled with his bonds, looking at the Bounts who were watching over him and Naruto. He had to alternate between pulling at the ropes and glancing at the Bounts, who were always looking back at him to make sure he didn't get away. Uryu had to be mindful of when the Bount, Fenrir, was looking at him and when he wasn't, because he would randomly snap his gaze in his direction. As Fenrir gazed at him, Uryu cursed inwardly once more, forcing him to halt his struggle lest Fenrir discover what he was doing. Every time he looked at Uryu, Fenrir snorted and narrowed his eyes. Then he turned to face Naruto and scowled before getting up and making his way to the blonde's cell, looking down at her with a look of pure resentment and asking, "What is so damn special about you, filth?" Clearly, Naruto was unable to reply. With a snort, Fenrir snarled down at the blonde and opened his cell. When Uryu realized this, he gave up fighting and yelled, "Give him a break." "Oh. You care about this thing, do you?" Fenrir sneered as he snapped his gaze to Uryu. Then, a savage and cruel smirk appeared on his face, followed by a dark glint in his eyes as he looked down at Naruto. He said, carefully pointing to Naruto's unconscious body. Uryu gave Fenrir an angry glare, saying, "You fucking monster, he is not a thing." With a guttural growl, Fenrir reacted angrily to the remark, saying, "Quincy scum, you have a lot of nerve calling me a monster." He took his cane and swung it at Uryu, slamming into the restrained Quincy and breaking the bone in his bicep as he did so. Uryu squirmed and exclaimed, "Gah!" Fenrir growled and yelled, "Even though I'm not permitted to murder you, I can still harm your useless hide, mongrel." After that, Fenrir raised his cane once more and struck Uryu more forcefully, breaking his collarbone and causing the Quincy to scream even louder. Then, he grabbed Uryu by the front of his face and pushed him back, which made the chair bounce, and he slammed his foot against Uryu's chest, sending a loud crack reverberating through the cell. Neither observed Naruto's unconscious form twitching as a dark energy began to seep out of his body while Fenrir was beating Uryu. Even as its raw power started to crash against him, Fenrir's senses were so clouded by his intense hatred for the Quincy that he failed to notice the energy gushing off of Naruto. He continued to beat Uryu viciously. However, Uryu sensed it, and even as the Bount was viciously beating him, he caught a glimpse of Naruto's form slowly moving out of the corner of his swollen eye as the dark energy emanated from him. Still full of blind anger, Fenrir lifted his arm and prepared to swing it down, only to have a blast of dark energy push them off Uryu and send them flying into the wall. Uryu's eyes widened significantly as he slowly turned to face Naruto, coughing painfully. Naruto's eye turned a golden yellow, and a noticeably hollow shell covered his form as he stood up, but that wasn't the reason Uryu's eyes widened. Glistening with dark essence, it was the Tonto in Naruto's right hand. With a painful cough, Uryu said, "N." Naruto, slowly turned to face Uryu, and the boy's features were marred by a dark grin. "No, Oturan." Fenrir had pushed himself up and was growling at Naruto during this time. The Bount got to his feet and gripped his cane firmly, saying, "Zij dick, hund." The Bount's cane suddenly glowed brightly before breaking into black smoke that rushed forward, condensed into a completely different form, and exposed the Fenrir doll. The great black wolf that stood in front of Fenrir had eyes that blazed brightly, a fierce power held back by the beast's eyes, and its fur absorbed all light, swallowing it up like a void. The wolf snarled as it prepared to leap into a stance, its eyes boring into the child who had injured its master. Oturan grinned and burst out laughing, saying, "Come on, dog." He then lunged at Fenrir and his doll, who retaliated in kind, in a move too quick for Uryu to see. Alongside Soifin as they were healing Yoshino, Soifin was pacing back and forth, and it was becoming obvious that he could not wait much longer. As she treated Yoshino, she continued to look at Orihime, asking, "How much longer?" Orihime was growing irritated. She could see why Soifin was upset, but Yoshino's healing was taking longer than expected because she kept asking every 30 seconds how long it would take. Looking at Soifin, she angrily yelled, "If you would stop asking me, I would be finished by now." Sincerely taken aback by Orihime's outburst, Soifin retreated before she resumed her skulking. She experienced a sudden surge of energy, the same energy she had experienced when Naruto, no, Oturan, first appeared. Sochi. Soifin abruptly drew her attention to the direction she sensed it was different from their intended course. The power exploded in Soifin's direction before anyone could have moved. As she felt the power spike at random and realized her child was fighting, she ripped across the roofs and leapt for her child's destination. Determined to get her child back, Soifin pushed herself as hard as she could, running faster than anyone could see, as well as murdering anyone who stood in her way. Alongside Naruto, because Oturan was unpredictable, he was able to push Fenrir and his doll back when he struck them, but Fenrir quickly regained the upper hand and struck back at Oturan, savagely attempting to subdue him. Fortunately, The other Bounts had sensed the Ryotsu spike and had been able to pin down Oturan and knock him out, but the hollowified part of Naruto's mind was unwilling to give up and had turned to dangerous tactics to try and fight back against Fenrir. After calling his doll back and wiping his bloody lip, Fenrir bowed his head and said, "I apologize, Karya. I did not anticipate the creature to be so stubborn." Karya glanced back at Fenrir and nodded, saying, "You have my forgiveness." He then turned to face the wall nearby and grinned, saying, "It seems our guests are soon to arrive." Karya then walked over to the fallen Uryu and lifted him up, grinning, before throwing him to Mizer, saying, "Mizer, Fenrir, take the two of them to the room. The Senkaimon will soon be opened." He then turned to the others, saying, "Ugaki, Ryo, Ho, and Ban, keep our guests busy while we make the final preparations." He then left, followed by the other Bounts. Following orders, the 4 Bounts mentioned above moved in the direction they sensed the approaching Shinigami. Alongside Soifan felt the Ryotsu spike and skidded to a stop in front of the mansion's gates. She swore as she sensed a barrier enclosing the area and took out her Zanpakuto 2, smashing it against the gates in the hopes of shattering it. "Wait." Soifan came to a halt, slowly turned her head, and stared with wide eyes at the person behind her. Ryuken Ishida, Uryu's father, was pointing a Quincy bow directly at her. As Ryuken's arrow flew and crashed into the gates, she immediately stepped aside, breaking the barrier and causing the gates to open. Ryuken looked at her, and Soifan stared at him. After exchanging glances and waiting for the other to answer, Ryuken said, "Let's go get our sons." For a brief moment, Soifan appeared surprised, but then she reacted and nodded, turned to face the mansion, and she and Ryuken went inside. A pair of eyes, which did not belong to a Bount, watched them from the top of the mansion the entire time. Ryuken followed behind her, his bow ready, looking left and right, while Soifan was in a combat stance, poised to strike. Soifan then mercilessly kicked down the doors to the mansion from which she felt Naruto's Ryotsu spike. When they arrived at the mansion, they anticipated a lot of things, including a small platoon of soldiers, a few bombs, and even an unexpected surprise for the enemy. They were surprised to find the lobby deserted. Soifan and Ryuken maintained their ready position in case they had not yet spotted a hidden enemy. While Soifan examined the different places she could imagine an enemy hiding in case they were planning an ambush, Ryuken scanned the surrounding hallways, his bow at the ready to fire. Nothing. No waiting enemies, no ambush. Ryuken frowned as he turned to face Soifan. She had sensed Naruto's Ryotsu spike, she had sensed him fighting a formidable foe, and she knew this was the right place. Soifan was in a similar situation, and as she looked around, nothing made sense. Why, then, was there no indication of the enemy anywhere? Slam! When Ryuken and Soifan heard the mansion's doors close behind them, the same doors that had just kicked off their hinges, they turned abruptly. In an attempt to detect any remaining Ryotsu, Soifan and Ryuken switched back to their combat positions and stood back to back, their eyes darting around the room. Did they sense it, too? Without warning, Ryuken shot an arrow into the ceiling, sending it plummeting in their direction, followed by a silhouetted figure. As the ceiling collapsed, Ryuken and Soifan rolled aside, and Ryuken then aimed his bow at the figure that had landed in a crouch on the rubble. As the dust started to settle, Soifan narrowed her eyes and stared at the figure. Then they widened when she saw the shape of the figure, which she knew was not a Bount. However, as a Shinigami, below the mansion Naruto and Ryu's forms were being pulled down a small tunnel beneath the mansion by Karya, Fenrir, Victor, Mizer, Koga, Yoshi, Sawatari, and Mabashi. There inside, the elderly Bount, Sawatari, scowled and turned to face Karya, saying, "I thought you said," after feeling the unexpected Ryotsu spike. Karya turned his attention to Sawatari. "I said, that any interference caused by the Shinigami, and the Quincy, would not put our plans in jeopardy. I did not however say they would be unable to breach the mansion. You would do well to remember that, Sawatari. Need I remind you that you are, in fact, expendable?" Sawatari took the hint immediately and muttered, but not before giving Karya a stern look. Karya either didn't notice or didn't care, because he kept moving forward, followed closely by Fenrir and Victor, with Koga following closely behind. When the Bounts finally arrived at a catacomb door, Victor approached, carefully picked up his necklace, and removed it. He stared at the necklace for a brief moment before he gripped the chain more tightly and turned to face the door, saying, "Zij Dick, Lightnum." As the clicks and whirs of gears inside the door started to reverberate throughout the catacomb, the locket suddenly gained a sickly green light that extended from the locket before shooting forward and slamming into a circular keyhole. The door opened abruptly, and the sickly green light sprang back into Victor's hands, turning into a locket once more, which he quickly wrapped around his neck. Even though they knew where they were going, the Bount all looked inside as the door opened because Victor had made it very clear that nobody, not even Karia, was allowed to enter his lab, not until now. When the Bount saw what was inside the laboratory, their eyes all widened in shock. 3 metal chairs, which looked like electric chairs but had needles protruding from the armrests, were surrounded by rows of Tesla coils that were arcing with lightning. There were also what looked like copper tubes that went back under the ground, but they had a hunch where those tubes went because of the holes in the bowl that was in the ground between the 3 chairs. "Bind them," Victor said as he entered and gestured to the chairs. As instructed, Fenrir and Koga pulled Uryu and Naruto toward the chairs, which were fortunately easy to locate, and quickly bound them with leather straps, binding their neck, arms, legs, and wrists as well as a leather strap across their abdomen. Karia approached Victor while Koga and Fenrir were getting Uryu and Naruto ready. Victor was flipping switches on an older piece of equipment that, considering the wires that connected it to the Tesla coils and all the other equipment in the lab, was the control panel. "I must say, Victor, I am quite impressed." Karia turned to face Victor's lab and said, "I never would have expected such ingenuity had I not seen it for myself." "Yes, it is impressive, given how many knots you used to tie my hands with." Victor flicked a single switch, making the Tesla coils arc even more fiercely than before, without even bothering to look at Karia. Karia snapped his head at Victor with a sneer, saying, "We succeeded, what does it matter if?" "We succeeded, after being set back near a decade, all because you placed such a high value on your bed." "Warmer," Victor said, pulling a lever and turning to face Karia. "Refer to my wife as such a thing again and I'll..." "Gah?" Karia's eyes narrowed as he grabbed Victor's shoulder. "Refer to my wife as such a thing again and I'll..." "Gah?" Karia cried out in agony as Victor grabbed his wrist and twisted it, forcing Karia to turn around. The rest of the Bounts took notice of the sudden action. Sawatari, Yoshi, and Mabashi just stared in disbelief, and Koga, Fenrir, and Mizer were about to use their dolls when Karia held up a hand to stop them. Victor twisted his arm further, but this did not stop Karia from flinching in agony. "You'll what, Jin?" he said, his voice noticeably sharp, "because you make a great many threats, but have yet to carry out a single one, because you know that should you so much as cut a single hair on my head, nick a single piece of skin, or so much as look at me in a way I don't like, then your only course of action will be to sacrifice your precious bed warmer, and yes, I will continue to call her that, because we all know that is all she has ever been, to you or anyone else." He then shoved Karia, causing him to stagger. With haste, Fenrir rushed to examine Karia, saying, "Brother," before giving Victor a stern look. As Victor turned back to his control panel, he ignored the Bount's glare. Fenrir growled at Victor and rose slowly, but Karia grabbed his arm and made him retreat. With a sigh, Fenrir checked Karia over and carefully assisted him in standing up. As Fenrir finished, Karia scowled at Victor and said sharply, "Just finish up the device, Victor, time is of the essence." Victor gave a smile, "I agree, given that your Shinigami pet will not be able to hold off our intruders for very long." That statement prompted Koga to step forward, saying, "Ugaki, Ryo, and the twins will be able to hold off the intruders before they get back here." At that response, Victor simply grinned and said, "Will they now?" There was silence in the lab as Koga turned to face Victor in confusion. As this was going on, Naruto and Uryu started to move and their hazy vision started to take in their surroundings. "Good, they are awake." Victor grinned as he saw this and started to flip switches before making his way back to the other Bounts. Now, all that is needed is the final piece to this puzzle. His eyes widened. "What, are you telling me that we are down here, in the catacombs, cornered, with no way out, and you are telling us we're still missing something?" "There had better be a damned good reason for this, Victor," said Sawatari. With a sly smile, Victor turned to Sawatari and said, "Mabashi." Yoshi and Sawatari turned to face Victor, and the orange-haired Bount turned to face him. "Would you be so kind as to tell me how many of my special chairs are sitting around the sepulchre?" Victor asked. "There are 3 chairs," Mabashi said, glancing first at the chairs and then back at the bowl in the middle, which he assumed to be the sepulchre. Victor laughed. "Correct. Now, answer me this, Mabashi, why would I have 3 chairs?" "Because, you need 3 chairs?" Mabashi asked, casting a questioning glance at Victor. Victor replied, "Correct, Mabashi. Now, given that 2 of those chairs are filled, what could the 3rd chair possibly be for? We have the Quincy, and we have the half-breed, but yet, there is a 3rd chair, and there is no way to return to the surface without having to face our intruders." Before the pieces started to fit together, Mabashi stared in further bewilderment, saying, "The 3rd chair is for one of us?" The entire Bount group fell silent as they all turned to face Victor, who was grinning knowingly. A dark twinkle flashed in his eyes, magnifying that unbearable, yet terrifying, smile. Yes, and no. Everyone in the group was immediately perplexed when Victor looked at them. You see, this device is quite delicate. If I were to use just any Bount, the device would likely break. The best case scenario is that it didn't work. He breathed a sigh of relief, with that in mind, and the fact we will likely only get one, maybe 2 shots at this, and given that the materials to make this device not only cost a fortune, but likely will take another century to locate, I would prefer not to have to go through another time-consuming century of rebuilding this. So, now, the only question is, which of you will fit the device perfectly? Victor eyed each of the Bounts like a cat eyeing a mouse, making the others suspicious. Victor went on to say, you see, this device utilizes the spiritual energy which naturally is a part of Shinigami, Quincy, and Bount, in order to perform its function and fulfill its purpose. He pointed to Uryu. Despite not having any spiritual energy himself, the Quincy's blood, his cells, contain the spiritual essence which the device will need to operate. The same goes for the half-breed over there. However, the final piece we will need is somewhat different. In what way, Doctor? Fenrir growled at Victor. Smiled. You see, it is not the energy of the Bount that we need the energy of the soul, human souls to be accurate, pluses. Unfortunately, unless the Shinigami have been providing human souls with a Gigai, then we have to resort to the last measure, as he gazed at a Bount, using the blood of a Bount, who has consumed a large number of human souls, living human souls. Victor's eyes were fixed on Sawatari, whose eyes had widened as Victor approached him. Sawatari swore, Zaijdi. But before he could say anything more, Victor rushed forward and stabbed Sawatari in the neck with a needle filled with green fluid. His body went limp, but his eyes revealed that he was still very much alive. Smiling and looking into the old Bount's eyes, Victor said, Sorry Sawatari, but you will not be calling on your doll today. He clapped his hands together, lifted Sawatari over his shoulders, carried him to the last chair, and strapped him in. Don't worry, that little cocktail I gave you won't prevent you from being of use. You can die easy, knowing that you will have helped secure the Bounts their victory. Mizer turned to face Victor as he finished strapping Sawatari in. Victor, you could not have possibly planned for the use of the half-breed, could you? She asked, turning to face Naruto. The doctor in question replied, You are correct, it was actually quite fortunate that we did not need a great deal of Shinigami blood in order for the device to work. At most, we would have needed an ounce of blood from Karia's pet. But the half-breed is only half Shinigami, won't we need more blood? Mizer asked, tilting her head. As he stood up and turned to face her, Victor nodded and said, Oh most definitely, in fact, if my calculations are correct, then we will need a great deal more blood from the half-breed. All of it, in fact. No. Victor's eyes went to Uryu, who was staring at him with such hatred that Victor would have perished 100 times over if appearances could kill. What was that Quincy? Victor knelt down and approached Uryu. No. D. Don't you dare H. Hurt him. Do W. What you want to me. B. But don't you dare hurt him. Uryu gritted his teeth and attempted, without success, to escape his restraints. He turned back to the control panel and said, Besides, what does it matter what happens to him? He is half Shinigami after all. Victor snorted and said, You are in no position to give me orders, Quincy. As Uryu cried out, He's a child, as the needles in the chair abruptly shot upward, piercing Uryu, Naruto, and Sawatari's forearms, Victor turned to face Naruto and shrugged, saying, So he is, doesn't change anything, Quincy. Gah! Exclaimed Naruto and Uryu in agony as Victor kept flipping switches. Will this kill them? Fenrir asked curiously as he approached Victor and scowled. Without turning to face Fenrir, Victor said, Yes, well, it will most likely kill them. I am about 99% certain that this will kill them. And if it doesn't kill them? Fenrir asked, glancing at Naruto and Uryu, who were gasping as the needles started to extract blood from them. When Victor finally turned to face Fenrir again, he grinned and said, If the device doesn't kill them, then by all means, feel free to stain your fingers with what is left of their blood. With a faint gleam in his eye, Fenrir turned back to face the doctor before continuing on his way. Let us begin, Victor muttered as he smirked and glanced up at a single lever before flipping it. And screams reverberated throughout the room. Ryukin and Soifun at the same time. A Shinigami, of all the things she expected, here? Soifun blinked in surprise as she stared at the Shinigami. Why? Before she could react, the Shinigami abruptly pulled out his Zanpakuto 2 and threw himself at Soifun, trying to cut off her head. Soifun narrowly avoided it, but his blow did manage to chop off a few strands of hair. Ryukin reacted immediately, hurling a barrage of arrows at the Shinigami, which were easily deflected. Quickly reacting, Soifun fired at the Shinigami, who was pushed against the wall after barely evading her own attack. At last, Soifun was able to get a clear view of her opponent. He was unmistakably a Shinigami, with short, raven hair that hung in the middle of his face, brown eyes that glared at her, and dilated pupils that stared down at her as he attempted to push back. His tall, slender frame was well suited to the sleeveless uniform he wore. Before he butted her and made her stagger back, Soifun swung a fist at the Shinigami, who quickly pushed harder against her weapon and avoided having his skull caved in by her punch. In response, Ryukin shot multiple arrows at the Shinigami, who had to duck because the butt caused some vertigo. After a quick recovery, Soifun shot at him, grabbing the front of his haori before swinging him into the wall, where his head smashed against it with such force that it was obvious he had suffered whiplash. Soifun didn't give up there. She kicked him in the middle of his back with a front kick after driving her foot into his lower back so hard she heard his spine crack. She then drove her foot's heel into his upper back, sending him crashing into the wall. It was nearly deafening how loudly the spine and ribs cracked. "Where is my son?" she asked, gritting her teeth, as she abruptly grabbed him by the hair and threw him to the ground while holding onto his hair. She then pressed the edge of her Zanpakuto against his throat. Blood started to trickle down the Shinigami's lips as he spat. "I don't know what." Soifun interrupted him and quickly punched him in the nose, causing a loud cracking sound that reverberated throughout the room. "Don't you dare play stupid with me, traitor. You are allied with the Bounts. Why else would you attack us, while inside their home?" Soifun growled as she yanked him up. She then pressed the blade against his throat just enough to cut it slightly, causing blood to trickle down his neck. "Where is my son?" she yelled at him. "Soifun." Soifun's eyes widened in surprise as she cast a sidelong glance. The door was lying on the floor once more, and she recalled seeing it fix itself only moments before. Orihime, Ichigo, Shad, Yoshino, and Yoruichi were standing in the doorway, staring at her, Ryukin, and the Shinigami, who was just inches away from having her Zanpakuto slit his throat. Taking advantage of this brief diversion, the Shinigami pointed to Soifun's stomach and said, "Show." A sudden generation of kinetic force pushed Soifun back before she could dodge, sending her flying across the room with her back slamming into the wall. The Shinigami quickly stood up, then turned and abruptly disappeared, pushing aside the debris surrounding him, indicating that he had used Shunpo. Soifun collapsed back to the ground and barely managed to stand again. Her eyes widened for a moment before narrowing as she growled, "Oh no you don't." She stood up and charged forward, then vanished as he had, pushing aside a lot more debris in the process. After witnessing everything, Yoruichi turned to the others and yelled, "Come on," as she started to run ahead, with the others following. The Shinigami was making his way farther inside the mansion with a specific goal in mind, and his practiced footwork made it obvious that he knew where he was going. Soifun, who was pursuing this Shinigami with murder in her sights, did not notice this, though. She only saw a traitor who was aware of her son's location, and she was determined to find him no matter how many bones she had to break. The Shinigami heard Soifun's venomous voice as she exclaimed, "Byakurai," but did not see her raise her arm or hear her snarl in disgust as she turned to face him. And he undoubtedly felt the lightning strike him, sending him tumbling and smashing into a decorative table, which caused splinters of wood to pierce his left arm. Taking advantage of his fall, Soifun leapt forward, grabbed him by the right arm, and twisted it around his back, pulling so hard that the joint that connected his arm to his shoulder nearly came out. Not wanting to give Soifun the pleasure of hearing him scream in agony, the Shinigami gritted his teeth and bit down hard. However, Soifun persisted in twisting his arm because she wanted him to experience as much pain as possible while he learned the location of her son. "You are going to tell me where my son is, or I am going to twist this arm until there aren't enough tendons left to keep it attached." She emphasized this by slowly twisting his arm a little more. She grabbed him by his hair and smashed his face into the wall as she leaned closer to him. Her voice was so cold that the pits of hell itself would freeze upon hearing it. Before biting back down, the Shinigami gave a pained gasp. "Answer me." Soifun smashed his face against the wall and twisted his arm harder, hardening his gaze to the point where stone felt like a fluffy pillow. The Shinigami's already fractured nose was smashed into near-permanent disarray, making it difficult to see clearly. Soifun was going to put more pressure on him. "Soifun, stop." She stopped and turned to face Yoruichi, Yoshino, and Ichigo, who were standing at her side. A few seconds later, Shad and Orihime appeared behind her, obviously more worn out than the other three. With a wince, the Shinigami took advantage of the brief distraction by shouting, "Byakurai," and showering Soifun with a lightning bolt that was charged with Ryotsu. "Gah!" Soifun exclaimed as she was hurled back, her body twitching and smoking from the electrical surge. Taking advantage of the situation, the Shinigami fled using Shunpo, while Yoruichi and Ichigo rushed to Soifun's aid. The direct strike of the Shinigami's Byakuya Aikido caused Soifun's body to tremble as electricity continued to arc through her system, causing her body to shake and convulse. Soifun's twitching slowed as the electrical burns started to go away, and she grunted in pain as she started to regain control of her body. Orihime leaned over her and whispered, "Soden Kishin." At that moment, her healing technique started to work on Soifun. Ryukin, who had finally caught up to them, came up behind them as Chad watched this happen. After witnessing Ryukin's eyes enlarge, Chad shouted, "Get down!" and let go of his spirit bow. Just before Ryukin's arrow ripped through it, sending its black body splattering across the walls, Chad and the others shot down in a hurry, but not before he saw a black, slithering mass that nearly resembled an eye with a mouth in the middle. The others, including Soifun, who miraculously recovered nearly fully from Orihime's technique, appeared to have noticed it as well because they promptly prepared their weapons. This demonstrated either Orihime's skills or Soifun's endurance. They saw a cloud of black eyes with mouths, similar to the one Ryukin had shot down with his arrow, as they looked down the hall. Shink, Soifun's eyes were full of rage again, and she started to attack the group of vile eyes, but Yoruichi pulled her back before she could lash out at him. She heard the sound of a blade piercing wood, and she looked down to where she was standing. A long sickle that had embedded itself right where she had just been standing emerged from the shadows created by the eyes. Without Yoruichi's intervention, the sickle could have easily sliced through her body, causing even more harm than the Kido spell had already done. When she looked forward again, she noticed that the eyes were creating more shadows, which in turn were creating more weapons, all of which, if her earlier observation was accurate, were equally lethal. Despite this, she prepared her Zanpakuto 2 and swung at an approaching blade that was aimed at her throat. While Ryukin and Orihime started to eliminate the shadow eyes from a distance, Yoruichi struck at a number of approaching sharp-edged weapons. Ichigo and Chad pressed close, blocking, parrying, and destroying the eyes with their superior strength. Even though she somehow managed to block and parry every weapon that came her way, Soifun charged forward, hacking, slashing, and crushing every single eye that stood in her way. As she cut through the resistance that dared stand in her way of her son, a raging conflagration raged in her eyes. Even as water started to seep through the floorboards, they creaked beneath her. Laboratory Underground Victor cast a heartless glance at the three people in chains, who screamed, twitched, and convulsed as their bodies were filled with enough electricity to hurt them severely but not enough to kill them. Then his eyes shifted to the pool of blood between them, still filling, but now pulsing within it was an arcing essence. Karia looked at Victor after noticing the arcing essence and asked, "How much longer?" Victor turned to Karia and asked, "When will your pet arrive, Karia?" He glanced at the pool and said, "Soon, once the sepulchre has finished filling, we need only funnel a substantial amount of Ryotsu into it." With a hint of outrage in his eyes, the white-haired Bount leader turned to face Victor and said, "Patience, Victor. I have faith that our ally will accomplish his task." Victor didn't say anything. "Forgive me, but I do not have faith in a Shinigami who would kill us as readily as he would kill his former allies." "Perhaps, but he needs us." "He won't." Karia frowns. Victor exploded. "He will do what he feels benefits him the most. If that means stabbing us in the back, he will. Remember, he betrayed his own kind, his allies, and friends, and at best, we are enemies in a ceasefire. He will not hesitate to do to us what he has done to them, because as much as he needs us, we also need him, and he knows this." Just as Karia was about to respond, someone outside the laboratory loudly banged on the entrance. Before advancing, Victor blinked and grabbed his locket, saying, "Zij Dick, Lightnum." The door creaked open as a green beam of light entered, and their Shinigami allies stood on the other side, appearing to be seriously hurt. With a snap, Karia said, "Report, Maki, did you accomplish your task?" With a limp, the now-named Maki lowered his head and said, "No, Lord Karia, I failed. They have not only entered the mansion, but I was unable to terminate any of the intruders." When he heard a sigh behind him, Karia's eyes widened and he turned to face the source of the sigh. What? Karia was about to say. "Maki Ichinos, would you explain to us why you were unable to terminate the intruders as you were ordered to?" Victor asked, shaking his head as he moved forward and turned to face Maki. "I don't answer to." "Oof," Maki scowled at Victor as he slammed a hard blow to the stomach. With a sigh, Victor looked down at Maki and said, "You will tell me why you failed to do your job, or I am going to inject this little cocktail I made directly into your carotid artery. Now, speak." He coughed and pulled his fist away, grabbing Maki by the hair and forcing him to look into his eyes. With his other hand, he pulled out a needle that contained a bluish fluid and pressed the tip to his neck. Karya stopped Fenrir from grabbing Victor after he growled at him and shook his head, forcing him to reluctantly back off. Maki, meanwhile, was visibly anxious, and he glanced momentarily at Sawatari and Naruto, the three individuals strapped into the doctor's chairs. Victor would have no problem causing him as much suffering as possible if he was prepared to do such things to his own children and allies. There were two intruders, and I used my Zanpack 2 to make them believe the door they came into was closed, before I attacked, Maki said, swallowing his pride. Squinting at him, Victor said, that doesn't explain to me why you failed to kill them. Before speaking, Maki swallowed. One of them was a very skilled Quincy, and the other was a woman with black hair who did this to me. She was a Shinigami. When Mizer decided to speak, Maki, Victor, Karya, and the others turned to face him. I almost killed her this night, but Yoshino stopped me from finishing her off, she continued. Maki replied, yes, she and the Quincy attacked me, got the better of me. I tried to retreat so I could perform my part in the ritual, but he was interrupted by Victor. In your condition, you wouldn't be able to light a candle, much less move our plans any further. Karya glared at Maki, his eyes narrowing into slits. Be calm, Karya. All is not lost. How? Maki is so injured that he cannot carry out his role. We are confined and cornered, and when they arrive, the Shinigami bitch will. Karya yelled at Victor. Provide us with exactly what we need. As Victor approached the Tesla coils and started to pull and insert multiple wires, everyone fell silent and gazed at him inquisitively. Meanwhile, a tiny smile twisted his face, alongside Soifan. Soifan felt something moist encircle her leg as she ducked beneath the approaching blades, ready to cut another eye. Whatever had grabbed her had pulled hard enough to knock her to the ground before she could react, and a blade that resembled a scythe descended toward her. After parrying the scythe with her Zanpack 2, she whirled it around in her hand and cut at the object supporting her leg. For a brief moment, she watched with morbid curiosity as more water tendrils started to emerge from the floorboards and start hitting Soifan and the others after she saw a tentacle of water being cut in two. Fighting a large group of enemies was difficult enough, but dealing with two was even more difficult. After snarling and slashing her Zanpack 2 at an approaching water tendril, Soifan backflipped over an approaching shadow scimitar out of instinct and slashed the eye that made the weapon in two. She then spun around and screamed, "Walls now." As Soifan pulled her arm back and yelled again, the others turned to her and obeyed, moving out of the way of the hallways and pressing themselves against the walls. "Shakaho!" she exclaimed, launching her arm forward as a red wave of fire erupted from her hand and roared through the corridors, turning many of the floating shadow eyes into ash and evaporating the water tendrils into steam. She spun around, pushed her arm back, and shouted again, "Shakaho!" Her hand sparked a blaze of red flames that burned the eyes and limbs in her path. Soifan gasped after using two extremely destructive Kido spells in quick succession, depleting her Ryotsu with less than a second between each use. Despite her exhaustion, she remained upright while the others moved away from the walls. "Soifan, are you?" Yoruichi said, putting a hand on her shoulder as she moved behind her. As she started to move forward, Soifan said, "I'm fine." Her tone made it obvious that the conversation was over. Ryukin glanced around as they followed Soifan, feeling uneasy. He could not be certain who was watching them, but they were undoubtedly being watched. "There you are," Soifan muttered to herself as she started to run after the trail, the others following closely behind, after searching the area for any indication of where the Shinigami had disappeared. At last, she discovered a remnant Ryotsu trail. More precisely, the Shinigami's Ryotsu trail. Soifan paused in front of a big door and scowled as she examined it. The Shinigami had undoubtedly run in this direction, but why? After a brief exchange of questions, she kicked the door as hard as she could, knocking it off its hinges because she was more worried about her child than she was about why a traitor would go anywhere. Before assuming a fighting stance, they all gazed in some astonishment at what was inside. The door behind it was not a room in the conventional sense, but rather the entrance to what could only be called a cavern, though there was more to the space than that. There were three figures inside: a tall, brown-haired man wearing formal wear with a golden pocket watch in his hand, and two twin boys dressed nearly identically. The man with the brown hair laughed and said, "Ah, so you have arrived. I was wondering if any of you would have the nerve to show your face." He opened his pocket watch and scowled, saying, "You are very late indeed." He then closed it and shook his head, saying, "Tisk, tisk, I am disappointed. I thought a mother and father would go beyond all barriers to save their children." While Yoruichi, Yoshino, and Ichigo prepared themselves, Chad positioned himself in front of Orihime, who prepared her long-range weapon, and Soifun tightened her grip on her Zanpakuto 2. Both Ryukin and Soifun narrowed their eyes at the man. First up was Ryukin, who said, "Where are our children, Bount?" "Oh," said the two boys, "they are nearby, but you will have to get past us to get to them, Quincy." Even as the other twins spoke, Ryukin squinted at the red-haired boy who raised his voice and said, "If you insist." He was already preparing his bow. As a spirit arrow blasted from Ryukin's bow and pierced the white-hatted Bount's chest, his eyes widened and the red-hatted Bount stared in horror. "Oh please, you couldn't even save him from getting taken in the first place. What makes you think you see a URK?" the Bount exclaimed. The red-haired Bount also gasped, "Ban, no URK," before collapsing on top of his brother. The man with brown hair stared in disbelief before turning to face Ryukin. Ryukin had to step back when he saw the man's eyes. They were as frigid as gazing into a frozen lake, just before it exploded from an unexpected warmth, in this instance, a fiery fury, that glowed in the eyes like a raging fire. Looking at the brown-haired Bount, Ryukin sneered, "That's why," and fired a third arrow, which the brown-haired Bount barely avoided, before grabbing his pocket watch and snapping. Zij's dick fried. Suddenly, as he swung the pocket watch, it transformed into a whip and wrapped itself around his arm like a snake. The whip never actually reached its target because Soifun snatched it and held onto it tightly before yanking on it as forcefully as she could, causing the brown-haired Bount to stagger forward. Before he could look down and see a huge cleaver that was pushed through his chest and probably coming out of his back, the Bount gasped abruptly as a stabbing pain tore through his chest. Just before the cleaver was torn from his body and the blood of the Bount started to spill across the floor, he slowly raised his head to face the weapon's wielder and met Ichigo Kurisaki's icy, irate eyes. His doll turned to dust as his eyes went blank. While Yoshino stepped forward and stared, Chad, Yoruichi, and Orihime could only stare in shock. Then, she looked forward into the caves and said, "I have never seen this place before." She looked around curiously. Although it did not appear natural, she could see that it had been there for a long time, perhaps centuries. How long had this existed and she was unaware of it? The Shinigami had come through here, so Soifun didn't stay to think. Instead, she moved forward to try to feel for any residual Ryotsu. As she did, she sensed another Ryotsu presence. Her eyes widened when she realized that this was where they had taken her son, and she started running deeper into the caves despite the others' warnings to stay up. When Yoruichi saw her flee, she cursed because she had also sensed Naruto's Ryotsu presence, just as Soifun had. "Come on!" she cried as the others ran up after her, constantly checking to make sure they hadn't unintentionally set off any traps. They had no idea what was inside, but Soifun, in her undoubtedly emotional state, wouldn't care. She would run through traps and who knew what else. Laboratory underground. Glancing back toward the laboratory door, Kariya scowled as he perceived what he could only describe as an echo, a release of Ryotsu, from what he perceived to be Han, Bo, and Ryo. They had passed away. Mizer turned to Victor and said, "The twins and Ryo have perished, only Ugaki remains." She then looked back at the laboratory doorway and said, "They will soon be upon us." He wasn't the only one who felt it. The others started to feel uneasy as her words reverberated throughout the cramped lab. Even though Ryo and the twins weren't the strongest in their group, they were definitely capable of fighting back. However, they were vanquished, and a Shinigami or Quincy's perishing could only be sensed in the echoes of their death. Maki swore as Koga splinted his bruised limbs, saying, "The intruders will be here soon, how do we?" "Maki, shut up." Maki's gaze shifted to Victor, who continued to tinker with his machine, his hands moving in ways Maki could not even comprehend. "We are cornered, we don't have what we need to finish our plans, and they just killed Ryo, Bo, and Han. No doubt Ugaki will be next, and I saw several others follow in after the Quincy and Shinigami before I managed to escape." Maki snapped, his eyes turning angry as he attempted to stand but was pushed back down by Koga. As he heard Maki's admission, Kariya snapped his head in his direction and asked, "Why did you not mention that?" Kariya was furious now. Having a Quincy and Shinigami present was bad enough, but what about the others? Maki said, "Kariya Sama, I meant to be," with a clearly terrified expression. Smack! Kariya hurried forward, backhanded Maki, and sent him sprawling across the floor after Maki fell out of his chair. Koga yelled, "Kariya Sama, he is," and got to his feet. Koga approached Maki and reared his fist back, but Kariya ignored him as Maki fought and was unable to stand again. "Save your energy, Kariya," Victor's voice saved his life. Maki turned to see Victor moving away from his machine and reaching for his necklace as he looked toward the laboratory door, but the aforementioned Bount leader stopped before his fist could slam into Maki's face. "You will need it," he said, holding the necklace gently in his hand. "Zij Dick, Lightnum," he snapped, his eyes narrowing. As the doors started to open, the same sickly green energy slammed into the lock and the whirring gears reverberated throughout the lab. All of the cavern's occupants were looking at Victor at that precise moment, as though he were insane. "That door could have held them off long enough for us to counter them. With it wide open, they will have nothing to tear through to get their brats except us," Mabashi said, finding his voice and echoing the group's concerns. "What are you doing?" he asked, staring at the seemingly insane scientist while ignoring him. "Mabashi is correct," said the blonde-haired Bount, voicing her concerns. Mizer looked at the door and asked, "What could you have for opening the door for our enemy?" as she reached for her katana. Victor put the locket back on his neck as the doors were closing and turned to Maki, ignoring Mizer and Mabashi. "Maki, do make yourself useful, and get to the control panel, and flip the switch," he said. Maki looked bewilderedly at Victor and asked, "What? I will not repeat myself, do it." Victor's voice seemed to echo a chilling tone, and his visible eye flashed a menacing rage that promised punishment if he did not obey. Victor's face took on a clear frown as he slowly turned his head, one eye looking towards Maki. Involuntarily swallowing, Maki straightened up and staggered over to the control panel. "Doctor, what the hell are you planning? Answer me," Carria said, her face contorted into an angry snarl. Instead of honoring Carria with a reply, Victor moved forward and stood directly in the middle of the doorway, slightly off to the side, making one specific person visible from the lab entrance. He and Naruto, alongside Soifun as he held her arm, which had a visible but insignificant gash from a sickle-shaped shadow that she did not notice until it had already sliced into her flesh. Soifun ducked beneath a dark blade that tore its way out of the shadows. She would have lost that arm if it weren't for her decades of combat and evasion training. Just as Yoruichi and the others arrived, she ducked beneath a shadow that appeared as an axe. Like rows of wheat, they started slicing through the eyes and shadows that projected them. Meanwhile, a lone figure stood on a ledge and peered down through his glasses at the intruders, more especially the Shinigami, who he could see was emotionally unstable, with his arms folded across his white button-up shirt and his red tie pressed against his chest. The ideal target. As he watched his shadow constructs start to focus on a single spot in front of Soifun, he smiled to himself before spreading his arms and looking down at the table in front of him, which was covered in several tarot cards evenly spaced out in a diamond shape. "Gessel, it is time to finish them." He reached for several of the tarot cards and arranged them in a new pattern. A great and terrible roar resounded from the bubbling mass as the shadows started to bubble and a huge, dark-colored hand started to reach out from them. A pair of axe-like blades tore from the shadows, almost ripping Soifun's head off as she turned to face the bubbling shadows and sneered as she got ready to strike. As it started to take shape, the bubbling mass of shadows burst into a huge twitching, swirling mass of black tendrils that were wrapping around each other to form muscle and sinew. The enormous arms tore from the shadows and joined the swirling mass. As he watched Gessel transform into its true form, Ugaki grinned and burst out laughing, his laughter reverberating throughout the cavern. "Zij Dick, Gerda," snarled Yoshino, who heard his laughter and turned to face the spot where it seemed to be most common. Suddenly, a cloud of flaming flames rose from the earth, and her doll, Gerda, appeared and turned in the direction Yoshino was looking. Yoshino said, "Gerda, finish him," as he turned to face him. With a nod, Gerda bounded forward, his flames setting the dark eyes on fire as he made his way to Ugaki, plumes of fire exploding behind him. Ugaki was so engrossed in his laughter that he failed to notice the doll until it was wrapped around his throat and burned so intensely that he was unable to scream. Gazing down at Ugaki, Gerda followed his mistress's instructions and started to squeeze the bespectacled Bount's neck. Snap, until Ugaki's neck broke with a loud snap that reverberated outward. He raised his arms to his face and watched as his fingers crumbled, until his very vision faded, turning to dust. Gessel screamed in pain as he felt his master die, and all he could do was watch as his shadow constructs started to fade into dust. After dropping Ugaki's body, Gerda turned to face Yoshino, who gave him a nod in return. Looking around, Soifun kept trying to sense Naruto's Ryatsu. However, she also sensed something else when she felt it. Pain. Pain that cannot be described. "No," she exclaimed as she hurried forward, toward the area where she could sense Naruto's Ryatsu echoing and the excruciating pain her unborn child was undoubtedly experiencing. No matter how many Bount she had to cut down, she was determined to end the pain. She kept going faster and faster as the others trailed behind her, running through the caverns, dodging stalactites and jumping over stalagmites until she came to a light at the end of the tunnel. And like a tidal wave, she felt the Ryotsu rush out of them. The entire world around her was meaningless. Only her son mattered, so she sped forward with her eyes fixed on one thing and ignored the cries from behind her to slow down and stop. As she got closer, she started to notice shapes emerging in the light. She saw a tall figure standing in the doorway, a chair, and a figure with spiky hair. Then his screams reached her ears. She abruptly stopped as she gazed into the doorway and saw the man who had abducted her child standing there with a self-assured grin. That didn't matter, though, when she turned to face him and saw her infant son strapped into a crude and outdated machine, twitching and screaming as she watched his body be struck by electrical shocks. She saw the man say something, but she didn't hear him. She just saw the man who was causing her child to be in this condition, and her eyes went red. As she attempted to reclaim her son, she lifted her arm and pointed it at him, saying that he was helpless, unarmed, and helpless in his current state. Her next blow would destroy him, and she would then cut down anyone who dared to stand in her way. "Shakaho!" she yelled, echoing with all her anger and hatred, and with a single burst, a flaming pillar erupted from her hand, shooting towards the Bount that had taken Naruto. She heard her comrades shouting behind her, and she heard her name for a moment, but she did not stop as she pointed to the Bount that had taken her child. Her vision improved as her body started to hurt from the amount of Ryotsu she used in her attack, and at last her gaze settled on the Bount's face. He was grinning. Concurrently Victor watched as the Shinigami woman moved toward the laboratory in trance, her rapid pace suggesting that she would arrive shortly. "Maki, flip the first 3 switches to the left, and turn the 8th knob until it is pointing at the 50, he said, turning to face Maki, who had at last reached the control panel. After a few seconds and some effort, Maki turned the knob and flipped the switches after glancing at the control panel. The Tesla coils that surrounded the lab started vibrating with a steady hum, echoing one another, and buzzing in unison. As they moved up the coils, the electrical arcs between them synchronized and started to hum. The assembled Bount started to scan the coils because they sensed something was off. They all turned to Victor, who maintained his air of composure despite the Shinigami woman sprinting in their direction. They could sense her anger and her desire to kill even from a distance. "Victor, whatever you are planning, do it now," Fenrir growled at Victor. Without indicating that he had heard Fenrir, Victor just looked at the approaching Shinigami before saying, "Press the green button on the right panel when she makes her move Maki. You'll know what it is." Maki turned to face the green button on the right panel, but she glanced back at Karia bewildered. Victor returned his focus to Soifan, who had skidded to a stop so near the entrance that she could undoubtedly see him. The other Bounts were standing apart, looking at Karia with some bewilderment and trepidation. "Victor, do whatever you plan to do it now," said Karia. After witnessing the Shinigami preparing a Hado, Victor finally acknowledged Karia's statement, saying, "I already have," with a smile. He could feel the sheer force of her Ryotsu as she fired the Shakaho, how it crashed into his body like a wave trying to chip away at a mountain's surface. However, that didn't really matter because he was staring at Soifan, hearing Maki press the button, and seeing her look at him with her anger fading as she started to think clearly. When she realized, he could see the realization on her face. He had set her up for failure. The Tesla coils roared with a deafening hum, drawing in the Shakaho, or more precisely, its Ryotsu, and channeling it into the sepulchre, which was now brimming with the blood of Sawatari and her half-breed son, the Quincy. The Shakaho never made it to him. The blood started to churn and glow as the Ryotsu struck it like a lightning bolt, splitting and boiling it as it bubbled. Victor ignored it, watching as the Shinigami, now aware of her actions, attempted to halt her attack only to discover that an unseen force was draining her Ryotsu. Her allies stood behind her, eager to help but unable to approach for fear of worsening the situation or because they were shocked by what they saw start to emerge behind Victor. The churning, boiling blood, which glowed in the darkness like a fire, started to swirl and float above the tomb, sucking in everything in its path. Victor turned around and started to move in the direction of the portal after feeling the pressure and spreading his arms while glancing at the Shinigami. "Thank you, Shinigami, your assistance was most appreciated." After taking a quick look at the Shinigami and her companions, the Bount all started to follow him. Fenrir was the only one who stayed, and he snarled as he snatched up his cane, raised it, and gazed at Uryu and Naruto, the 2 defenseless young men. "Fenrir! Behind you!" cried Karia, but he didn't see the projectile coming until it was too late. With the others and Soifan, 1,000 burning needles were jammed into Soifan's cells one by one, causing her to scream in agony as she felt her Ryotsu being torn from her by an invisible force. While the others were frozen in fear of worsening the situation or gazing at the whirling vortex behind the Bount that had abducted Naruto, Yoruichi was the first to take action. Orihime was about to follow suit when she noticed a Bount who had decided to stay and turned to look at Naruto and Uryu. She saw him tighten his grip on his cane as he started to raise it, his intent evident, and his eyes narrow with hatred. As soon as he started swinging his cane at Naruto, she reacted swiftly, extending both of her arms and yelling, "Koden Zanshin!" A glimmering light erupted from her hairpins and shot at the remaining Bount. When she heard one of the other lingering Bounts yell, the one that attempted to hurt Naruto jumped out of her path, missing her attack and colliding with the lab's strewn about equipment. Whatever was draining Soifun was stopped by the collision that followed, which set off a chain reaction that sent strong energy bursts throughout the cavern. When she was freed, she staggered forward, looked up, and started to run. The chairs that were almost next to the portal started to shake as they were torn from the ground, and the Tesla coils were torn from their foundation as the two Bounts saw her approaching and leapt into the portal as it started to spin faster and start sucking in everything around it. When Soifun noticed this, she acted swiftly. She ran as quickly as she could in Naruto's direction, even as she staggered from having her Ryotsu sapped. As she approached, she could hear the metal snapping and the chairs still trembling. Snap! When she saw the chair Naruto was strapped in to start to float off the ground and be dragged towards the portal, her eyes widened in horror. "No!" she exclaimed, managing to quicken her pace and leap towards Naruto as the portal started to pull him in. The others were following closely behind, feeling the portal's suction start to pull them in as well. The chair was also raised off the ground as Ryukin bounded over to Uryu and started to attempt to unbind him. As the portal pulled Soifun and Naruto in, Yoruichi and Yoshino, who was now carrying Orihime, leapt after her. Soon after, Ichigo, Chad, Ryukin, and Uryu arrived as the portal started to close. Then, in a sudden outburst of Ryotsu, it exploded, destroying the laboratory and bringing down the cavern. Within the portal as the portal's rippling vortex tossed its occupants around like debris in a hurricane, Soifun reached for her son's form, still bound to the chair his kidnapper had put him in. As the vortex started to reopen, she was able to finally grab hold of the chair and reach for her son, which undoubtedly led them to their destination. As they attempted to reach Soifun, the vortex threw them around until it started to calm as an opening opened up and they were able to see where they were going. Yoruichi and Yoshino followed closely behind, the latter holding Orihime close to her. Chad and Ichigo's faces were filled with shock, and Ryukin held Uryu against his body, but he was able to look once as the vortex revealed where they were going. Ichigo asked bewilderedly, "The Soul Society?" and glanced at Chad before turning back to the vortex's entrance. At the end of the vortex that had carried them there, the Seiretii and the neighboring districts of Rukongai were visible. "Why would the Bount want to go to the Soul Society?" Chad asked, echoing the worries of the majority of them as they stared in bewilderment. The question remained unanswered as they started to realize that they would soon be in the air and falling toward the Rukongai given their current elevation and the speed at which they were leaving the vortex. As they started to descend, Ichigo attempted to grab hold of Chad, Ryukin, and Uryu, but Yoruichi grabbed hold of Yoshino and Orihime. When Yoruichi looked forward, she was shocked to see Soifun still clinging to Naruto with her bindings. "Soifun!" she cried in desperation. Without making any movement, Soifun heard Yoruichi grabbing for the straps holding her infant in place and attempting to free him so she could cradle him in her arms once more and never let go. Because of her tunnel vision, she was blind and only saw her child. She was unable to see the dimensional rift that revealed the Soul Society or the end of the vortex. She saw nothing but her shackled son as she emerged from the vortex and started to descend toward the Rukongai. In an attempt to catch Soifun and Naruto, Yoruichi cursed as she hurried forward, but she was too far away and already struggling with Yoshino and Orihime. "Let me go." Her eyes widened as Yoruichi's gaze shifted to Yoshino's face and she gazed inquisitively. The light emanating from Yoshino's skin gave off the impression that she was radiating power. Yoshino turned to face Yoruichi and yelled, "Let me go, or they are going to die," in a tone that left no room for debate. Despite her frown, Yoruichi nodded her head and let go of Yoshino. Unprepared for the unexpected rush of speed Yoshino unleashed, she shot in the direction of Soifun and Naruto, spinning momentarily before turning back to face them as Yoshino sped in their direction. Even though she was staring, Orihime shook her head and said, "We need to go after them." "You read my mind." Yoruichi nodded, and she repositioned her fall to attempt to keep as close to the three of them as she could. Yoshino continued to speed in their direction, oblivious to Soifun and Naruto's rapid descent to the hard ground in front of them. When Yoshino entered the Soul Society, she felt her power explode in a way she could not even describe. It was as though every muscle in her body had been amplified to its utmost potential, giving her the impression that she had infinite power at her disposal. Yoshino sped forward, but she was unable to explain how or why. She had an invincible feeling. As she spread her arms and bounded toward the falling mother and son, these thoughts were thrust aside. After struggling to remove his restraints due to her weak body, Soifan eventually started to undo the strap. The air of Soul Society was gradually reviving her, and she managed to break his restraints, but she gasped and felt sick when she had to take Naruto's arm out of the chair and discovered a long needle stuck in his wrist. As she gazed up at Naruto's pale face, she attempted to speak but her voice was caught in her throat. Those eyes that never blink. When she saw what she could only describe as her son's corpse, her heart sank. No. She pushed out as much of her spiritual pressure as she could to try and slow their descent, but before she could say another word, Yoshino slammed into her and Naruto, drawing them closer. Her efforts to slow their decline started to prove more than challenging, and she felt her reserves, which had felt limitless just moments before, being depleted almost immediately. As she saw where they were going, she drew Soifan and Naruto closer and screamed, "Hold on!" just before they slammed into the ground after colliding with the roof of one of the buildings in Rukongai. With Orihime and Yoruichi, Soifan, Yoshino, and Naruto had landed a few buildings away, but Yoruichi was able to land much more gently. As soon as they landed, they hurried to the scene of the crash in the hopes that they had survived. Yoruichi put Orihime down as they leapt into the building and turned to face the location of the trio's crash. Yoshino was clutching Naruto while sobbing into his chest while leaning on one leg and gritting her teeth in agony as she looked at Soifan. When Yoruichi saw Naruto's condition, those glassy eyes, the pale skin, her eyes widened and she let out a gasp. As she sobbed into her son's chest, her body trembling, she held him close and begged him to wake up, to look at her, to call her Ka-chan. No, she heard Soifan scream. Her only answer was silence. Her son's body was stained by her tears, and each cry made her body tremble. Soifan place, Orihime reached for Soifan, who was already climbing into the crater off to the side, but Soifan screamed back. No, she cried as she pulled him in closer, his body swaying like a rag doll as she cradled him against her body with tenderness but firmness. Orihime clenched her fist and said softly, "Soifan, please, let me help," as she stared in shock. Her eyes widened as Soifan gazed up at her, then turned back to Naruto. She started to let him go with a noticeable tremble and placed him on the crater's floor. Just then, Yoruichi stopped Ryukin, who was carrying Uryu, from running into the building with Chad and Ichigo. Orihime knelt down, extended her hands, inhaled deeply, and said, "Soden Kishin." She started to apply as much spiritual pressure as she could to the technique, and two bursts of light emerged from her hairpins, creating a barrier around Naruto's body. As she attempted to heal Naruto, Orihime started to clearly strain, hoping that her power would be sufficient to return him to his former state. As she watched his wounds slowly start to heal and his skin slowly start to regain its color, Soifan begged and pleaded that her son would be okay. Before Yoruichi looked at Orihime, she and the others stood by and watched. As Orihime's bones and flesh started to hurt and she pushed more of her Ryatsu into the technique, she started to perspire and felt as though she was forcing her entire being into it. Gah! When Naruto's gasp reverberated throughout the room and his chest started to rise and fall as he started to inhale air, everyone's eyes widened. Soifan screamed, "Sochi!" and nearly jumped forward, but Yoshino stopped her, indicating that the shield was still healing Naruto. Her eyes were so wide that they seemed to be about to burst out of her skull. Ka-chan. Soifan watched Naruto slowly turn his head in her direction, his eyes now glimmering with vitality. She started to cry happy tears, her hand slowly reaching forward as Soifan felt a smile tug at her lips. Orihime nearly fell when Naruto slowly started to raise his hand as well, just as she was finally unable to maintain the healing barrier any longer. Ichigo had jumped up and grabbed her tightly as she almost fainted in his arms. She started to cry as Soifan's hand entwined with Naruto's, and then she leaned forward, encircling Naruto with her free arm and holding him against her. She nodded as she looked up at Orihime, and then she said, "Thank you," as sincerely as she could. Orihime could only grin as she gradually started to nod off. "Why? You're welcome," she managed to say before fainting in Ichigo's embrace. Before turning to face Soifan, who was clinging to Naruto as though he would vanish if she let go, Yoruichi knelt beside Ichigo and Orihime, held her hand against her, and sighed, "She'll be fine, she just needs rest." She couldn't help but laugh quietly. Yoshino gave the mother and son a smile and couldn't help but feel sad, but she quickly turned her head away when Soifan got up. When they started to leave the house, Ichigo carried Orihime's bridal style, and her eyes were brimming with an amazing warmth. Soifun felt Naruto tighten his hold on her as he gazed down at her, who gave her the kind of affection a son would give his mother. They were back together, and no one would ever take them apart. The Bounts would be compensated for their efforts.
That's it for today. I hope you guys enjoyed this great story. See you in the next one.